A boy screams on a plane. The cabin freezes. Passengers recoil. Flight attendants exchange uneasy glances. But one woman walks forward, not away. What happens next will ripple across an entire industry. This is not just a story about turbulence at 35,000 feet. It's about what happens when a multi-billionaire father is forced to confront something money can't control, his autistic son's pain. It's about a black flight attendant who reaches across fear with compassion and changes everything. What happens when the world sees disability as disruption? What if the greatest intelligence goes unrecognized until it breaks? And what would you do if the person you tried to silence held the key to transforming not just your family, but the entire system? This is a journey of silence, of struggle, of rediscovery, and of love in its rawest, most unfiltered form. So buckle in, because the real turbulence isn't in the sky. It's in the hearts we're taught to hide. If stories like this move you, stories of justice, empathy, and second chances, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Billionaire's disabled son melts down mid-flight. Black flight attendant. Calms him. He cries. Let's begin. John F. Kennedy International Airport was alive with movement. Overhead announcements echoed from the arched ceiling like restless ghosts. Rolling luggage hummed over polished floors. Parents herded overtired children. Flight 20876 to Seattle was scheduled to board in 25 minutes, and Caleb Monroe stood near Gate 44, eyes darting between the departure screen and his 13-year-old son, Jonah. Jonah sat cross-legged on the floor beside the windows, tracing invisible lines between aircraft outside. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the side of his leg, a soft pattern of 5 fast beats, 3 slow. Caleb recognized it. Satellite alignment code. Something Jonah had once explained with incredible clarity on a car ride that neither of them had forgotten. 20 minutes until boarding, Caleb said gently. Jonah didn't look up, but his fingers stopped tapping. That's 24 minutes early for a gate change, Jonah murmured. They'll likely move us to Gate 45B. The Delta 760 is delayed. It uses this jet bridge. Caleb allowed himself a brief smile. Let's stay here until it happens. He didn't correct his son. He never did. Not unless absolutely necessary. Jonah didn't respond well to sudden redirects. Caleb had learned that over years of watching therapists try and fail to bend his son into some neurotypical mold. It never worked. What did work sometimes was patience, space, and not pretending to understand what he didn't. A toddler screamed behind them. Jonah flinched. Caleb tensed. A businessman brushed past, muttering, "Great. Another unparented kid in first." Caleb said nothing. He'd heard it before. The whispers, the sighs, the barely contained looks of irritation from strangers who assumed wealth came with perfect behavior. They didn't see the invisible wires Caleb held every time he traveled, with Jonah balancing routine, pressure, and fragility in equal measure. He checked his phone. The boarding time had changed 2 minutes later now. Just a small delay, but small delays meant big shifts for Jonah. He knelt beside him. They pushed boarding back 2 minutes. Jonah's shoulders tightened. Which means the aircraft rotation is off, probably refueling or waiting for a cleaning crew. That changes my expected takeoff window. It's not aligned. Do you want to check the live tracker? Jonah pulled out his tablet like it was a shield. He opened the app and breathed slowly. The tapping resumed, but softer this time. Caleb exhaled. A soft voice interrupted the moment. "Excuse me, are you Mr. Monroe?" Caleb turned. A gate agent in a Navy uniform stood nearby. "We've moved boarding to Gate 45B. Jonah didn't even look up. Told you, he said. Caleb nodded once. Thank you. As they gathered their things, Jonah clutched the handle of his roller bag with practiced grip, but his steps had grown hesitant. They were moving out of sequence. The seating chart, the lighting, the noise, all unpredictable now. Caleb knew the signs, the quiet before the storm. At gate 45B, the lounge was crowded. Families filled every row. A woman with a service dog sat near the window. A young couple argued over boarding passes. The lights above buzzed slightly, something only Jonah noticed. Caleb took out the noise-canceling headphones from his bag and handed them to his son. Jonah refused with a shake of his head. They'll distort the pitch of the engines. I need the clean signal. Okay, Caleb said softly. He didn't press. A man in a tailored suit glanced at them and muttered to his companion, Seriously, we're paying top dollar to fly with kids who scream for 6 hours. Caleb felt the words like a slap. He almost said something. Almost. But Jonah was watching the planes again. Shoulders stiff, jaw tight. He was holding it together. For now. Boarding was called. First class first. Caleb guided Jonah through the crowd gently, scanning his boarding pass as they entered the jet bridge. The air smelled of fuel and recycled air. Jonah slowed, his fingers brushing the side wall as they walked, as if grounding himself through touch. At the door to the aircraft stood a flight attendant. Her posture was calm but alert, and her eyes softened as she took them in. Welcome aboard, she said. Her voice was low, melodic. Thank you, Caleb replied, guiding Jonah ahead. The attendant bent slightly toward Jonah's eye level, not intrusively, just enough to offer acknowledgement without demand. What's your name, sweetheart? She asked gently. Jonah blinked. That's a lot of social pressure, he replied flatly. The attendant's smile didn't falter. Then I'll just say hello. I'm Imani. I'll be here if you need anything. She stepped back, no questions asked, and moved to greet the next passenger. Caleb took a slow breath. That moment, small as it seemed, was everything. No insistence, no awkward joke, no he shy, just space and respect. Jonah settled into his window seat and immediately began syncing his app with the flight data. Caleb took the aisle, hands folded in his lap. The engines whirred softly as the last few passengers trickled in. Outside, the lights on the tarmac flickered as dusk deepened. The pilot's voice came overhead. Ladies and gentlemen, we got a short delay. Air traffic congestion over Ohio. We'll be taxiing shortly. Thank you for your patience. Jonah's head snapped up. Caleb's stomach dropped. I calculated a 5:12 p. Departure, Jonah whispered. I know, buddy. It's just a small delay. But that changes everything, Jonah replied. I had it mapped. The sequence, the pattern, his breathing picked up. Caleb gently placed a hand over his son's. I'm here. We're okay. But Jonah was slipping. His hands flapped once, then twice. His body rocked against the seatbelt. His voice rose not loud yet, but high-pitched and fast. I can't. The route is wrong. I need the right vector. Oh, passenger, 2 rows up, turned. Is he going to be like that? The whole flight, Caleb clenched his teeth. I'm handling it. Imani reappeared beside them, crouching low. Her presence was quiet, still. She didn't speak, just waited. Present, not demanding, not dismissive. Jonah looked at her, his breath ragged. She nodded slowly, her expression calm. And for a moment, he stilled. Just for a second. But it was enough to remind Caleb that perhaps he didn't have to hold this alone. Not today, Not anymore. Jonah's fingers twitched. His breathing had become sharp, clipped like he was trying to pull air through a straw. Caleb kept his hand resting gently over his son's, not squeezing, just anchoring. He could feel the vibration of Jonah's distress humming beneath the skin, a soft static building into something louder, faster. Imani stayed crouched beside the row, not reaching, not correcting, just being there. Her eyes moved from Jonah to Caleb with a kind of wordless communication. She had seen this before. Caleb could tell. Not with Jonah specifically, but with someone. Maybe a sibling, maybe a student, someone whose inner world ran on different wiring. "What's changed?" she asked gently, addressing Jonah, but not insisting on a response. Jonah didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the seatback tray in front of him. "The flight plan is broken," he said. "It was supposed to take off at 5:12, then enter holding pattern over Columbus, then altitude drop at 6001. Now it's disrupted." His voice trembled with the weight of that word. "Disrupted." Imani nodded slowly. "That makes sense," she said calmly. "That's hard. When things don't go the way you prepared." Jonah blinked rapidly. His hands fluttered once more, then curled into fists. Caleb was ready to intervene, to redirect, but Imani beat him to it. She leaned just slightly forward. "Jonah, may I show you something?" She kept her tone low, gentle, like a soft jazz note floating under the roar of jet engines. Jonah didn't respond, but he didn't say no. That was enough. She reached into the pocket of her uniform and pulled out a laminated card. It was worn at the edges, clearly used often. On it was a simplified overhead map of a commercial airliner cabin. "This is my route card," she said. "It shows all the zones I move through during the flight. Doors, galley, lavatory locations, snack cart paths, everything I need to stay steady." Jonah's eyes flicked to the card. "I use it when I feel disoriented," she continued, "because when my sister Zaria flies, she needs patterns. And when I help her, I try to build structure for myself too." That caught Jonah's attention. "You have a sister?" he asked quietly. Imani nodded. "Zaria's 29. She types on a device to talk. She once calculated the circumference of Saturn's rings using only a grocery receipt and a ballpoint pen." Jonah tilted his head. "I could do that, if the receipt had unit markers." "I believe you could," Imani said warmly. Something in Jonah's face shifted. It wasn't calm, exactly, but the full-force storm had paused. A breath in the chaos. Caleb felt the difference immediately. It was the moment where meltdown pivoted into recovery. And it was always delicate, always unpredictable. Imani didn't press further. She placed the laminated card gently in the seat pocket in front of Jonah. "It's yours for the flight," she said, "in case you need a fixed pattern." Then she stood and returned to her position at the front of the cabin. Caleb exhaled, only now realizing he'd been holding his breath. He looked at Jonah. His son's fingers had returned to their tapping rhythm, but it was slower now. Measured. Caleb leaned in. That was kind of her. Jonah nodded once. She didn't lie. Or pretend. No. Caleb agreed. She didn't. The plane finally pushed back from the gate. Engines revved. The floor shuddered. Jonah reached for the laminated card. His fingers traced the outline of each row. Caleb noticed that he traced their own seat number twice. "Do you want to try the breathing routine we practiced?" Caleb asked. Jonah considered it, then gave a small nod. Caleb whispered the counts. "Inhale for 4. Hold for 2. Exhale for 6. They did it together. Once. then twice. Jonah's shoulders relaxed slightly. Caleb turned to the window just as the aircraft lifted off the runway. The sky outside was a burnished silver, city lights dimming below like scattered glitter. The seatbelt sign chimed. Jonah leaned his head back, still gripping the card. "We're at rotation speed," he said softly. "Yes," Caleb replied. For a moment, they simply flew. 20 minutes into the flight, the cabin lights dimmed. Jonah was quieter now, still alert, still humming softly to himself, but the storm had passed, at least this one. Caleb sipped water, eyes moving around the cabin. First class wasn't full. The man from earlier who had muttered something about kids in first was now asleep with his mouth open. 2 rows back. A woman with a toddler gave Caleb a knowing look, the silent nod of a parent who has seen chaos and weathered it. Then there was Imani. She moved through the aisle with ease, poised, watchful, offering snacks and drinks with a smile, but always scanning. Her hands, her posture, it all suggested experience, not just flight safety, emotional weather patterns, human storms. When she reached their row again, she paused. "Doing better?" she asked. Jonah didn't look up, but he replied, "Stabilized." Imani grinned. "That's my favorite flight status." She turned to Caleb. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible. "No need," she replied. "It's part of the job." "No," he said, "it's not. But you did it anyway." She nodded, accepting the compliment without modesty or pride, just grace. Then she leaned in a little closer. "He reminds me of Zaria, not in behavior, but in energy, in how much he's thinking, even when it looks like he's falling apart." Caleb blinked. "That's exactly it. People assume it's chaos, but it's computation. It's him trying to make sense of things with incomplete data." Imani rested a hand briefly on the seat back. "You're doing a good job, Mr. Monroe." Caleb looked at his son. Jonah was now drawing on his tablet, sketching out the projected flight path from memory, overlaying it with colored vectors. "Some days I don't feel like I am." Imani gave him a soft look. "Then you're probably doing better than most." And with that, she moved on. Caleb leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. He hadn't expected this flight to feel like a turning point. He'd expected exhaustion, survival, maybe shame, but instead, there was a glimpse of something different. Not ease, not yet, but maybe the beginning of something gentler. He looked at Jonah again. His son caught his gaze, then said without looking up, her voice is in the 200 hertz range. Like Mom's. Caleb's throat caught. "Yes," he said. "It is." Jonah didn't respond, but his expression softened. Outside the window, the stars blinked in patterns only Jonah could truly read. And for the first time in a long while, Caleb wondered if maybe, just maybe, they weren't flying toward another storm. Maybe they were flying toward something better, something that looked a little like hope. Jonah was quiet, but Caleb had learned long ago that silence wasn't absence. It was density. Thoughts compressed into soundless calculation, looping in circuits only Jonah understood. And tonight, even with the laminated flight card pressed flat against his tray table, Caleb could feel the pressure building again. The flight had reached cruising altitude. Passengers were settled. Overhead bins clicked as flight attendants moved through with water, blankets, and the occasional gentle hush. It was the quiet time, the time Caleb usually cherished on long flights, but not tonight, not with the look on Jonah's face. His son was staring at the in-flight screen, not watching the movie, not tracking the map, just staring, Still. Too still. Caleb felt it first as a shift in energy. Then Jonah's hand twitched. Caleb leaned closer, his voice low and steady. "You okay?" Buddy Jonah didn't answer. His lips moved, but not toward words, toward numbers. Quiet mutters. Decimal points. Coordinates. Vector directions. Caleb knew the rhythm, knew when it became a chant. That chant was a warning sign. He reached for Jonah's shoulder, gently. But Jonah flinched, hard, then hissed. No contact. Imani, walking past with a tray of tea, stopped immediately. Her body stilled the same way Caleb's had earlier, like someone who recognized a tremor before the earthquake hit. "Is it the screen?" she asked softly. Jonah's eyes stayed on the glowing rectangle. "No. It's the feed delay. The telemetry. It's not matching the satellite relay. It's wrong. It's wrong, and I can't fix it." Caleb blinked. He'd seen Jonah spiral over small breaks in expected routines before. A missed turn on the drive home. A sandwich cut wrong. But this was different, bigger, like the fracture line of a glacier. Silent, but devastating beneath the surface. Imani crouched again beside the row. What would help right now? Jonah shook his head. Rapidly. Can't fix feed. Can't override remote sync. They shouldn't delay by 8 seconds. It's deceptive. "Okay," Imani said calmly. "Let's forget the screen. Want me to turn it off?" "Won't matter. It's still lying." The word landed like a crash. Caleb watched as Jonah's body stiffened. His fingers were clenched into his palms so tightly they trembled. His breathing hitched. His entire nervous system collapsing inward like a neutron star. And Caleb froze. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know which thread to pull. Which word would ground his son, and which might cause the whole tower to collapse. Then Imani spoke again. "Jonah," she said softly, "may I ask you a question?" Jonah didn't respond with words, but he didn't say no. Imani took that as permission. "If the system is lying," she said, "what truth do you see?" Jonah blinked, then slowly turned toward her. "The altitude should be 3520, but the interface shows 34.8. That's a 320-foot drop unaccounted for. And the satellite arc isn't consistent with a westward vector. It's skewed. And if I can't trust the data, I can't build models. If I can't build models, then the future is," he stopped. Frozen. There it was. The real fear. If he couldn't trust the pattern, then the world itself became unsafe. Caleb swallowed hard. Imani nodded, never looking away from Jonah. "May I tell you something Zaria taught me?" she said gently. Jonah looked hesitant, but he gave the smallest nod. She said, "Some systems are always going to lie. It doesn't mean we're wrong to trust patterns, but it means we might have to build new ones, internal ones no satellite or feed can touch." Jonah stared at her. His hands loosened slightly. "And that truth," Imani added, "comes from observation, not obedience." Caleb didn't fully understand what she meant, but Jonah did. Caleb could see it. He nodded again, then slowly, deliberately, turned off the in-flight screen. The cabin dimmed further as the attendant signaled lights out for rest. Pillows were passed around. A few people stretched and reclined, but Caleb and Jonah stayed upright. Jonah rested the laminated flight card on his lap and began to sketch something on the back in pencil. Not frantically, methodically, as if rebuilding something broken. Imani gave them both a soft smile before continuing down the aisle. Caleb turned to his son. "What are you drawing, new trajectory?" Jonah replied. "Based on what wind vector? Cabin pitch." I'm recalibrating the vertical angle. It won't match the screen. Caleb smiled faintly. Sounds like your own model. Jonah paused, pencil hovering midair. Then, quietly, Mom used to say that. She said I see things sideways, but that sideways is still a direction. Caleb's throat tightened. He hadn't heard Jonah mention Elena in over 6 months. She was right, he said softly. Jonah nodded once, then returned to sketching. The rest of the flight passed in a strange sort of peace. Not quiet, exactly, but settled. Jonah finished 2 full pages of calculations, then folded the paper and tucked it into his travel binder. Caleb stayed awake, watching the sky out the window as faint stars emerged. When breakfast service began just before descent, Imani returned with warm muffins and water. Jonah accepted one without a word. But as she stood to leave, he spoke again. I built a model, he said, not looking up, using only observable metrics. Imani tilted her head. How's the trajectory stable? Jonah said. Even with chaos. Imani smiled. That's a good model. They shared a brief moment of mutual understanding. Then the captain's voice crackled through the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent into Seattle. Please fasten your seatbelts. Caleb did as instructed, then glanced at his son. You ready for landing? Jonah gave a small nod. Caleb placed a steady hand near Not on his shoulder, just close enough to let him know he was there. Together, they braced for the next shift. And for once, Jonah didn't flinch. He was still sketching, still calculating. But now, Caleb realized, he wasn't trying to escape the turbulence. He was charting a way through it. The plane began to descend. The clouds thickened outside the window, but inside their row, something had cleared. Not completely, not forever, but enough. Enough for Caleb to whisper a quiet thank you into the air. Thank you for the laminated card. Thank you for the soft voice. Thank you for someone who understood that patterns can fall apart, but love doesn't have to. The wheels touched down with a thud that rippled through Jonah's chest. He didn't cry out, didn't bolt, but his fingers pressed hard against the armrest, eyes blinking rapidly in a rhythm only he seemed to understand. Caleb kept his gaze forward, resisting the urge to speak. Sometimes Jonah needed time to file the sounds, to label them in his mind. Cabin pressure equalized. Engines shifted pitch. The forward motion slowed, and Jonah exhaled a breath he'd been holding for minutes. We landed, he murmured. We did, Caleb replied gently. 72 seconds behind scheduled arrival, Jonah added, his voice steadier now. Caleb smiled faintly. Maybe they caught headwinds. Jonah turned toward him. I accounted for that. Caleb opened his mouth to reply, but stopped when he noticed Imani watching them from the front of the cabin. She didn't speak, just nodded once. A silent acknowledgement of everything that had unfolded in the air between New York and Seattle. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Caleb glanced down at the sketch Jonah had made during the flight. A series of hand-drawn calculations over a model of the plane's projected angle of descent. He wasn't sure what all the symbols meant, but he understood the structure the comfort Jonah found in organizing chaos into order. You going to save that? Caleb asked. Jonah looked down at the paper and folded it crisply into his binder. Yes, I need to analyze the inconsistency between actual versus perceived descent gradient. Caleb didn't press further. That was Jonah's way of making sense of the world. Where others found safety in routines, Jonah found it in data, in geometry, in the math that didn't lie. The aircraft stopped. Seatbelts clicked open. Overhead compartments banged. People rose like they'd just survived something. Maybe they had. Caleb waited, letting the rush pass. When Jonah finally stood, He did so with a practiced precision. Backpack on, laminated card tucked into his front pocket, eyes scanning the row markers. He didn't speak, but his posture was more relaxed than it had been in hours. Caleb moved into the aisle behind him. As they approached the door, Jonah hesitated just for a second beside Imani. "I don't like dissent," he said. Imani looked at him with a soft, grounded expression. "Me neither," she replied. "Too many variables." Jonah continued. "Too much that isn't in my control." Imani nodded. "And yet, here you are." Jonah blinked once, then moved forward, on the jet bridge. Caleb caught up to his son. "What was that closure?" Jonah said simply. Caleb almost laughed, not in mockery, in awe. The terminal was bright with overhead lights, clean linoleum floors, rows of chairs. Seattle's humidity clung to the glass windows. Jonah navigated it like he'd trained for this, eyes focused, avoiding the chaotic crowd at baggage claim. Caleb had booked carry-on only, knowing that a lost bag could trigger a spiral. Still, Jonah's voice wavered slightly as they walked. "There are fewer variables on the plane." Caleb nodded. "I know. It's louder down here. I know." They stepped into the taxi line. A light rain had begun outside. Jonah pulled his hood over his head and leaned close to Caleb's arm, not quite touching, but close enough to feel the warmth. By the time they reached their hotel, it was nearing midnight. Caleb unlocked the door to their suite and let Jonah in first. The room was as he'd requested, 2 beds, neutral colors, blackout curtains. But Jonah froze in the doorway. Something was off. The furniture layout, the mirror on the wrong wall, the absence of the small welcome booklet most hotels leave on the desk. Caleb caught the hesitation. "Want to move rooms?" "No," Jonah said after a beat. "Just give me 5 minutes." Caleb stepped back into the hallway. He waited. When Jonah called him in again, the room had been subtly rearranged, lamps adjusted, pillows stacked symmetrically. The desk chair rotated slightly to face the window. "Better," Caleb asked. "Still not ideal," Jonah admitted, "but adaptable." He unpacked methodically, placing his shoes parallel at the closet entrance, his toothbrush in the far right holder, his notebook in the drawer beside the bed. And then, just as Caleb turned off the lamp on his nightstand, Jonah spoke again. Was she like that Caleb turned? "Who, Mom?" Caleb swallowed. "She liked order," he said slowly, "but she wasn't rigid. She used to say life is a series of controlled descents. You don't have to like turbulence. Just learn when to tighten your straps." Jonah looked down at his hands. "I miss her sometimes, but it's fuzzy, like a photograph that didn't load all the way." Caleb nodded. "It's okay to miss her, even if the details are blurry." Jonah crawled under the covers, face turned toward the wall. Caleb lay back too. In the silence, the rain whispered against the window. Then Jonah's voice floated up again. "Why did she pick the name Jonah?" Caleb smiled into the darkness. "She said it meant dove, a symbol of peace." "That's ironic," Jonah murmured. "Why I don't always feel peaceful." Caleb's voice dropped low. "You don't have to feel peaceful to bring peace." There was quiet after that, a long, stretching quiet, filled only by rain and breath and the hum of possibility. The next morning, the city rose damp and silver around them. Breakfast was a quiet affair. Jonah picked a toast. Caleb nursed black coffee. They had an afternoon appointment at the Seattle Neurodivergent Learning Collective, a place Caleb wasn't sure Jonah would even step into. "You ready for the visit?" Caleb asked cautiously. Jonah shrugged. "I'm not ready, but I'm willing." That was more than Caleb expected. He signaled the waiter. As they stood to leave, Jonah tugged lightly at Caleb's sleeve. "Do you think the lady, the one from the plane, do you think she's real?" Caleb looked down at him, puzzled. Imani Jonah nodded. "She said things that made sense, like Mom used to." "She's real," Caleb said. "More real than most people." Jonah didn't reply, but as they stepped outside into the crisp Seattle morning, he didn't pull up his hood, didn't put on his noise-canceling headphones. He just walked, eyes forward, like someone descending into something unknown, but not necessarily falling. Not this time. The rain in Seattle wasn't like the rain in New York. It didn't shout. It whispered. As Caleb and Jonah stepped into the waiting area of the Seattle Neurodivergent Learning Collective, the city's soft drizzle clung to their jackets and made the windows glow like old film. Jonah clutched his laminated schedule in one hand, his fingers twitching against the edge in small, rhythmic pulses. The building was sleek but welcoming glass panels, warm oak floors, a scent of lavender and old books hanging gently in the air. A receptionist with curly gray hair and kind eyes stood as they approached. "You must be the Monroes," she said. "Welcome to the collective. Dr. Lennox will be right with you." Jonah didn't respond. He scanned the space instead. Tall ceilings, no flickering lights, no harsh smells. He stood still, processing, cataloging. Caleb murmured, "Want to sit?" Jonah nodded once and eased onto a low chair, angling himself slightly toward the exit, but staying seated. It was his version of compromise. Caleb sat beside him and exhaled slowly. He didn't realize how tense he'd been until the scent of calm began to work its way into his shoulders. A few minutes later, a woman in her early 50s with salt and pepper dreadlocks and a navy cardigan stepped into the room. Her presence didn't announce itself. It invited Mr. Monroe. "Jonah," she said with a warm smile. "I'm Dr. Avery Lennox. I'm so glad you made it." Jonah's eyes flicked to her shoes, then to her necklace, a silver spiral, and finally, her face. "You're wearing cotton," he observed quietly. "Dr." Lennox tilted her head. "I am. Synthetic blends make my skin itch." Jonah nodded. "Same?" And just like that, the tension dropped a fraction. She led them down a corridor filled with student art and quotes about perception, diversity, and sensory language. At the end was a small room with a round table, beanbag chairs, and walls painted a soft gray blue. "Jonah," Dr. Lennox said gently, "you're welcome to explore or ask questions. We want you to feel safe, not judged." Jonah walked the perimeter, not speaking, tapping the wall once with his knuckle. Caleb remained standing, unsure of his role. Dr. Lennox gestured for him to sit. "When Elena and I started this center," she began softly, "we wanted to create a space that didn't try to mold autistic minds into something they weren't. We built this for kids like Jonah and for parents like you, trying to love them the right way." Caleb blinked, the mention of Elena his. Elena landed unexpectedly. "She volunteered here," he asked. "Dr. Lennox nodded. "Before Jonah was even born. She helped us design the quiet rooms and reading nooks." Jonah stopped pacing. "My mom worked here." "She did." "Dr. Lennox said with a warm smile. "She brought in a sensory integration model based on constellations, said every person was their own little galaxy." Jonah's fingers stilled. "She said that she did. And from what I've read in your intake forms, I'd say she was right." Caleb felt something loosen in his chest. He'd brought Jonah here out of desperation. Now he wondered if he'd actually brought him home. A knock on the door broke the quiet. A tall black woman peeked in. "Sorry to interrupt," she said. but I thought I recognized someone from Flight 2876. Imani Rhodes stepped inside. Jonah's body straightened like a ruler. You live here? Imani smiled. Not quite. My sister does. She's been part of the program for years. Jonah tilted his head. Is she verbal? She communicates differently, Imani said. She types. Sometimes signs. Does she stim all the time? Jonah processed this. Cool. Caleb was stunned. This was the most conversational Jonah had been with anyone outside their bubble in weeks, maybe months. Imani turned to Caleb. I asked Dr. Lennox if I could join this part of your visit. With your permission? Of course. Caleb looked at Jonah. Is that okay? Jonah's response was immediate. Yes. She's predictable. Imani laughed. I'll take that as a compliment. They walked together through the rest of the center. There was a tech lab where older students worked on coding and robotics. A soundproof sensory room lined with kinetic sand, tactile walls, and soothing lights. A community kitchen where teens learned recipes based on dietary needs: gluten-free, low sugar, high protein. Jonah asked questions, not many, but thoughtful ones, about floor plans, about sound frequencies, about the chair heights and their possible impact on posture-related STEM behaviors. The staff responded with respect, no forced eye contact, no redirection when Jonah flapped his hands in excitement after a perfectly phrased answer. At one point, they passed a young woman seated at a small table, typing into a device. She looked up briefly, met Jonah's eyes for a second, and smiled. Hi. Her device said a moment later. Jonah's mouth twitched. Hi. Caleb watched it all, stunned by the ease with which Jonah moved through the building. How the structure of the space and the empathy of its people made room for him, made room for all of them. As they returned to the front of the center, Dr. Lennox handed Caleb a folder. Take this home. No pressure. But if Jonah wants to attend twice a week, we have space. Jonah held up 2 fingers. 2 days is good. Caleb blinked. You sure I decided 10 minutes ago? Imani stepped forward. I can be here those days. My flight schedule's flexible. Caleb looked at her, surprised. You do that. I think your son already trusts me, she said softly. And you look like a man trying his best not to mess up. Caleb laughed, half embarrassed, half relieved. That's exactly what I am. They stepped outside. The sky had cleared. The sun was out, reflecting off puddles and glass. Jonah looked up. It's brighter now. Yeah, Caleb said. Yeah, it is. They rode in silence back to the hotel. That evening, Jonah rearranged the hotel furniture again this time, slightly different. When Caleb asked why, Jonah simply replied, I feel different now. Later. As Jonah read through the orientation packet in bed, he asked quietly, Do you think Mom would like that place? Caleb sat on the edge of his own bed. I think she helped build it. Jonah nodded once. That night, he fell asleep without headphones, without the usual ritual of checking the door 3 times, without resistance, and Caleb stayed up long after, staring out the window at the still, bright city. For the first time in years, he let himself imagine a future not built around fear or crisis, a future with possibility, with people who understood, with flight paths that didn't always have to circle back to grief, just forward, gently, together. The morning began with an unusual quiet. It wasn't that Jonah wasn't awake. Caleb could hear him softly adjusting the room's light dimmer by fractions, likely calculating the exact luminance needed for reading. But there was no checklist recitation, no countdown to breakfast, No tap, tap, tap on the nightstand. Caleb let it be. In the kitchen of their hotel suite, he brewed coffee while reading the orientation documents from the Seattle Neurodivergent Learning Collective. His eyes lingered on one line. Progress isn't measured in volume of words spoken, but in depth of comfort gained. He smiled. That felt true in ways no standardized test had ever captured. A soft knock on the open kitchen doorframe caught his attention. Jonah stood there, dressed, holding a printed itinerary. "It's Sunday," Jonah said, tapping the top of the page. "Unstructured." "Yep," Caleb said, pouring another cup. "No school, no center, no appointments," Jonah added. There was a pause. Jonah looked down at the paper. "I don't like that." Caleb waited. Jonah continued, "Dr. Lennox said that sometimes new input is better than no input." Caleb tilted his head. "So what are you thinking?" Jonah hesitated. "I want to see the museum." Caleb blinked. "You want to go out?" Jonah nodded once. "The Pacific Science Center. It has a planetarium. Mom talked about it in her journal." Caleb felt something tighten in his chest. "Yeah, she loved that place. She wrote that it felt like being inside a thought." Caleb nodded slowly. "Then that's where we'll go." They arrived just after the museum opened. The line was minimal, the staff friendly, and the lobby quiet enough for Jonah's breathing to remain steady. Inside, the air was cool. The space was open. Each exhibit offered an invitation, not a command. Jonah drifted toward the physics wing first, but it was the astronomy hall that drew him in completely. He stood beneath a hanging replica of the solar system, tracing orbit lines with his fingers in the air. They placed Saturn too close to Jupiter. He murmured, not annoyed, just factual. A nearby docent, a college student with piercings and bright eyes, overheard and smiled. "You're totally right," she said. "The model's compressed to fit the room." "Which disrupts scale accuracy," Jonah added. "I want to see the real distances projected," she asked, gesturing toward a touchscreen wall. Jonah nodded. Caleb stepped back, letting them interact. It was easy to forget sometimes that Jonah was still just 13. He spoke like a scientist, but moments like this, his curiosity alive. His eyes wide, it reminded Caleb that his son was still a kid. After the solar exhibit, they entered the planetarium. It was dim, quiet. A soothing voice narrated the history of the cosmos while stars blinked across the domed ceiling. Jonah whispered to Caleb during the presentation, pointing out inconsistencies in star brightness, questioning the narrator's phrasing. But he wasn't agitated. He was engaged. When it ended, Jonah didn't move for a long moment. Finally, he said, "Mom was right. It's like being inside a thought." Caleb didn't speak. He just placed a hand gently on Jonah's shoulder. Jonah didn't pull away. They left the museum just before noon and walked through Seattle Center. The air smelled of roasted nuts and cold metal. Jonah was quiet, processing. Caleb didn't rush it. When they returned to the hotel, there was a message from Imani. "Just checking in. Thought you two might want company for dinner tonight. No pressure." Caleb showed the message to Jonah. "I like her," Jonah said simply. Caleb raised an eyebrow. "You want to invite her?" Jonah hesitated, then nodded. "Okay," Caleb said, texting back. "We'd love that." "Dinner at 6. Imani replied almost instantly. "Looking forward to it." At 5:45, Caleb started prepping the table. Jonah adjusted the lighting and even rearranged a chair to ensure symmetry. "She has long legs," he explained. "The current spacing is insufficient." Caleb bit back a smile. At 6:03, a gentle knock sounded. Jonah opened the door without prompting. Imani stood there, wearing a deep green sweater and holding a small bag. "Hi, Jonah," she greeted. "I brought something for you." Jonah accepted the bag carefully. Inside was a small, plush model of a neuron fabric with colorful threads, each dendrite labeled. "I saw it at the center gift shop," Imani said. "Thought of you." Jonah examined it with a mix of intensity and awe. "It's anatomically accurate," he said, then paused. "Thank you." "You're welcome," Imani said. Stepping inside, dinner was simple pasta, salad, garlic bread, Jonah's idea of a balanced meal. As they ate, Imani asked gentle questions. "What did you like best at the museum?" Jonah answered without hesitation. "The comparative planetary densities." "What about the planetarium?" "Better than expected." "Would you go again?" Jonah looked up, met her gaze for 2 seconds, then said, "Yes." It was the longest sustained eye contact Caleb had ever seen from him. After dinner, Jonah excused himself. He wanted to write in his travel journal. As the door to the bedroom closed, Caleb turned to Imani. "He's opening in ways I didn't expect." Imani nodded. "You gave him the right soil. He's growing in his own direction." Caleb leaned back, tired but content. This trip had started in panic, but now it's becoming something else. She finished. "That's the thing about turbulence. It shakes loose what we try to hold too tightly." He looked at her. "Is that how it was with your sister?" Imani paused, then nodded. "Zaria taught me patience. But more than that, she taught me how to listen without needing to fix." Caleb thought about that, about all the years he'd spent trying to fix Jonah's world rather than join him in it. "You've been good for us," he said quietly. Imani looked surprised. "I haven't done much. You've done exactly enough." They fell into a silence that wasn't awkward. It was filled with something warm and waiting. The bedroom door creaked open. Jonah padded out, holding his notebook. "I wrote about the neuron," he said to Imani. "It helped me explain why I stim when I get excited." "It's not a flaw." "No," Imani said gently. "It's a signal. Your body's telling you something matters." Jonah considered that. "I think I'll keep the neuron in my backpack." Caleb smiled. "That's a good place for something important." Later. When Imani left, Jonah walked her to the elevator. "Will you come again?" he asked. She smiled. "If you'd like me to." "I do." As the elevator doors closed, Jonah turned to Caleb. "She makes the air easier to breathe." Caleb felt his eyes sting. "Yeah, she really does." That night, as Jonah slept, Caleb stood by the window again. Seattle sparkled like a thought just forming, like a neuron firing in the dark. He didn't know exactly where this journey would go, but tonight, at least, it felt like they weren't navigating alone anymore. The morning after their quiet dinner with Imani, Caleb awoke before the sun. He sat on the edge of his bed, watching light creep over the Seattle skyline through the half-open curtains. It felt like the beginning of something solid, something real. Yet beneath that calm surface, he could feel an old uncertainty rising. That creeping fear that any step forward with Jonah might crumble with one unexpected noise, one unfamiliar room, one look from a stranger. In the next room, he could hear gentle shuffling, the steady pattern of Jonah's pacing. It was always the same 4 steps. Pivot, 4 steps back. The rhythm was his version of breathing when the world began to feel too large. Caleb tapped softly on the doorframe. "Morning, buddy." Jonah stopped, mid-step, and looked up. "There are only 3 days left before we go home." "That's right," Caleb said. entering slowly. "Does that make you nervous?" Jonah didn't respond at first. Instead, he walked to the window, peering out at the cloudy sky. "I'm trying to decide if this was an anomaly," Jonah said. "If being here this calm was just because it was new, or because it was safe." Caleb stood beside him. "Can it be both maybe?" Jonah replied. "But if it's just temporary, going home might erase it. That's not how growth works." "Jonah, how do you know?" Caleb looked at his son carefully. "Because I'm growing too, and I know how hard you've worked to get here." Jonah didn't argue, but he didn't agree either. He pressed his forehead gently against the glass and whispered, "The hotel hallways smell like lavender and carpet glue. Our house smells like floor polish and sadness." Caleb's throat tightened. "We can change that. We can make home feel different." "Can I choose a new scent?" "Absolutely." Jonah turned. "Cinnamon and pine." Caleb nodded, quietly making a mental note to stop by a candle store later. That afternoon, they visited SNLC again. Jonah had been invited to a small peer group discussion, something he normally avoided at all costs. But Dr. Lennox had assured them it was voluntary, low pressure, and centered around a topic Jonah adored: systems logic in everyday life. Caleb waited in the lobby while Jonah joined the group. He sat near the large bay windows, flipping through a copy of The Atlantic, but not really reading. His mind was too full. He thought about Elena, about her notebooks, her marginalia, her conviction that Jonah's mind was not broken, only built differently. He thought about Amani, her steady hands, her way of speaking that calmed more than her words alone. He thought about Jonah's voice, quiet but purposeful, when he'd said, "Cinnamon and pine." A presence settled beside him. "I saw your son in the circle," Dr. Lennox said, offering him a tea. He was contributing, actively. "That's new," Caleb admitted, accepting the cup. "Not really," she said. "He's always had the desire to connect. He just needed the conditions to feel safe doing it." Caleb nodded slowly. "I used to think the goal was to prepare him for the real world. But maybe the goal is to change the world around him." Dr. Lennox smiled. "That's the beginning of advocacy." They sat in silence for a while. Outside, a light drizzle began to fall, misting the glass. "You've done well by him," she added, "even when you didn't have the map." Caleb appreciated the sentiment, but deep inside, guilt stirred. "Not always. There were days I pushed too hard, made him mask too much." Dr. Lennox looked at him. "And now you're unlearning. That counts. 2. Later, when Jonah emerged, his posture was different, less guarded. His fingers were curled loosely around the fabric neuron Amani had given him, and he was humming. Not loudly, just under his breath. But it was a sound Caleb hadn't heard in months. "How was it?" Caleb asked as they walked to the car. "I talked about train switches and how decision-making models are flawed when you assume binary logic," Jonah said. One of the other kids said it made sense. "That's great." They didn't laugh. Caleb looked over. "Why would they laugh?" Jonah shrugged. "Sometimes people laugh when they don't understand." "Well, it sounds like today they understood." Jonah looked out the window, his voice barely audible. "Maybe I was too hard on them before. Maybe you're being kinder to yourself now." That night, back at the hotel, Jonah didn't follow his usual routine. He didn't ask for the water to be filtered 3 times. He didn't double-check the door lock. Instead, he sat on the couch, reading from Cosmos. Elena's handwriting illuminated by the lamp beside him. Caleb watched from the dining area, sipping tea. It was a quiet, that didn't feel empty. Then Jonah closed the book and said, "Do you think Mom knew how hard it would be?" Caleb set the mug down. "I think she knew it wouldn't be easy, but she also believed you were strong enough for it." Jonah nodded, almost to himself. "I'm not sure I believe that yet." "You don't have to," Caleb replied. "You just have to keep going." "I liked talking to the other kids," Jonah said. "It was tolerable. That's high praise coming from you." Jonah cracked the smallest smile. "It is." Later, just before bed, Jonah stood in the doorway of Caleb's room. "If I mess up when we get home," he said, "will you still believe I'm trying?" Caleb stood and crossed the room, placing his hands gently on Jonah's shoulders. "Always?" The boy nodded. Then he surprised his father with a quick, awkward hug. Caleb didn't move, didn't breathe. He knew enough not to prolong it. When Jonah pulled away, he didn't say anything. He just turned and walked to his room, closing the door softly behind him. Caleb stared at the empty hallway, heart pounding. Something was shifting, slowly, carefully, but undeniably. The shadows between their progress were still there, but for the first time, they weren't afraid of them. They were learning to walk through. The final morning in Seattle arrived quietly. Rain tapped at the windows, a gentle percussion against the hotel glass as Caleb packed the last of their things into a sturdy black duffel bag. Jonah sat cross-legged on the floor, precisely folding his socks by color gray to blue to black and humming softly to himself. There was no sign of distress, no pacing, no breathless counting of exits. Just Jonah, calm and methodical, his shoulders loose and his expression focused. For the past few nights, he had been sleeping through until morning, an unfamiliar luxury for both father and son. "You're sure about the flight?" Caleb asked, zipping up a bag. Jonah nodded. "Still folding?" "Yes. I reviewed the seating chart. Same aircraft type, same aisle orientation." Caleb crouched beside him. "And if it doesn't go like last time," Jonah looked up. His eyes were steady, something stronger behind them now. "Then I'll recalibrate, like the robotics team did with the faulty sensor." Caleb smiled. "That's a good plan." They arrived at SeaTac Airport 2 hours ahead of boarding. This time, Jonah walked through the terminal with more purpose. His backpack was slung over one shoulder, a small weighted keychain in his hand, his own grounding tool, chosen from SNLC's sensory room. As they waited near gate C-14, Caleb spotted Imani just before Jonah did. She was in uniform again, a sleek navy vest and slacks, her hair pulled into a neat low bun. Her eyes met Caleb's first, and something unspoken passed between them. Imani turned toward Jonah and smiled. "Look who's early." Jonah gave a rare grin. "You're working our flight again." "I am. Thought I'd make sure the sky treats you kindly today." Jonah shifted his weight from foot to foot, then offered her the weighted neuron keychain. Zaria said small familiar items help retain continuity across different settings. Imani took the keychain, cradling it carefully. "I'll keep it close." As boarding began, Imani guided them onto the aircraft, ensuring they were the first to settle on. Jonah took the same seat as before, 13A left window, while Caleb sat beside him. "You remember the routine?" Imani asked gently. Jonah nodded. Noise-canceling headphones, visual schedule on the tablet, and the breathing technique. He demonstrated a slow inhale, held for 3 seconds, then exhaled. His fingers tapped gently against the armrest in a familiar pattern. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats again. Imani smiled. "Looks like someone's ready to fly." As the cabin filled, Caleb noticed a passenger across the aisle watching Jonah with a frown. A middle-aged man in a sharp blazer, eyes narrowed, face already set in annoyance. The plane began taxiing. The engines roared to life. Jonah tensed for just a moment. His eyes flicked to Imani, standing near the galley, and then to Caleb. "I can do this," he whispered. "You already are," Caleb replied. The wheels lifted. Flight 2876 was airborne again. Half an hour into the journey, Jonah opened his tablet and began sketching orbital patterns, not just doodles complete gravitational simulations, coded with icons only he understood. Every now and then, he would pause to adjust the angles, murmuring to himself about retrograde motion. Caleb watched with pride, until the man across the aisle leaned toward the flight attendant beside him. "This isn't first-class behavior," he muttered. The attendant blinked. "Excuse me, sir." His muttering, his tapping. "This is supposed to be a premium experience." The words pierced the quiet like a pin through silk. Caleb turned slowly, his voice calm but firm. "He's not bothering you. It's disruptive. He's autistic." The man rolled his eyes. "Then maybe he shouldn't be flying?" Imani was there in an instant. Not with force, with grace. "Sir, if you're uncomfortable, we can find you another seat," she said. "You're rewarding his noise with special treatment." "No," Imani said, standing straighter. "I'm supporting a passenger's right to exist safely. You're welcome to accept that or file a complaint after landing," the man grumbled, turning back to his seat. Caleb's heart pounded. He glanced at Jonah, who hadn't stopped drawing. He didn't hear. He whispered to Imani. She nodded. And if he had, well, it wouldn't be his fault. Or yours. She stayed by them longer than necessary, checking on other passengers while never straying far. Her presence, quiet and steady, formed a kind of emotional perimeter. An hour later, the turbulence hit. Jonah's hand snapped to the armrest. His breathing changed. Imani crouched beside him, one hand lightly on the armrest. "It's like the ocean," she said. "The air has waves, too." Jonah didn't answer, but his fingers began mimicking ocean ripples instead of tapping. The turbulence passed. So did the tension. When the plane leveled, Jonah leaned toward the window. "Are we above Montana yet?" he asked. Caleb pulled out his phone, opened the map. "Just crossing into it now." Jonah smiled faintly. "Good. It's my favorite state from the air." "Why?" "Because the land is vast. It gives you room to think." Caleb nodded. "That makes sense." 2 hours before landing, Imani brought them both tea. Jonah had apple juice instead, poured into a ceramic cup to reduce sensory discomfort. "This is different than last time," Jonah said. "You're different," Imani replied. "Better no. Just more yourself." Jonah thought about that for a long time, then quietly said, "That's a good thing. Right?" Imani's smile held the kind of warmth that stayed long after it was gone. "Exactly right." As the captain announced their descent into Boston, Caleb felt the shift in Jonah again. A little less tension, a little more breath. When the wheels touched down, Jonah didn't flinch. When the seatbelt light turned off, he didn't bolt for the door. He waited. When they stood, he turned to Imani. "Will we see you again?" Imani tilted her head. "I hope so." He nodded, then, in the most surprising gesture yet, held out his hand. She took it, gently. "Thank you," Jonah said, "for being constant." Caleb could hardly breathe. The walk through Logan Airport was different than before. Jonah held himself differently, not just with more confidence, but with more presence. Outside, waiting for the car, Jonah looked up at the sky. "It smells different here." "Cinnamon and pine," Caleb asked. Not yet, Jonah said. But it could. Caleb wrapped an arm around his son's shoulder. Then let's make it so. As they drove home, Jonah asked if they could stop by the science store downtown. He wanted to pick up a kit for building light sensors, maybe even a new telescope lens. Caleb agreed. He would buy every lens in the store if it meant keeping this window open. And maybe, just maybe, it would stay open long enough for them both to walk through it, side by side. The first morning back in Boston was quiet. Too quiet. Caleb stood in the kitchen of their brownstone, staring at the steam curling from his coffee. The house felt strangely hollow, like a place that had not yet remembered how to echo. Outside, the trees had begun their slow shift to red and gold, announcing autumn's arrival. Inside, everything felt paused. Upstairs, Jonah was still asleep. That alone was a miracle. In years past, he would have been awake at dawn, pacing the hall, rearranging books by weight, or muttering flight schedules to himself under his breath. But now, Jonah slept in, as if his nervous system had exhaled something it had carried too long. Caleb didn't know what to do with the stillness. He walked slowly into the living room, stopping at the bookshelf. Among the rows of aerospace journals and antique compasses was a thin, well-worn journal. Elena's handwriting still graced the spine. He hadn't opened it in over a year. He pulled it out and held it, fingers tracing the edge of the cover. He remembered her voice reading from it late at night, whispering dreams about Jonah's future into the quiet. She had believed so fiercely in a world that would adapt to him instead of asking him to change. Caleb closed his eyes. Maybe that world wasn't a fantasy after all. A soft creak on the stairs pulled him back. Jonah appeared at the landing, hair tousled, still in pajamas, clutching a weather chart in one hand. "There's a pressure system moving over Greenland," he said by way of greeting. Caleb smiled. "Good morning to you, too." Jonah sat at the table, unfolding the chart beside his cereal. "It might affect transatlantic flights today. Are you planning one?" Jonah shook his head. "Not yet." They ate in silence, Jonah fully absorbed in the weather patterns, Caleb watching him, both of them somehow grounded. Later that afternoon, Jonah asked if they could go to the library. Caleb blinked. "The public one." Jonah nodded. "I want to check out the new exoplanet catalog. You want to go in person?" "Yes. It smells better." It was such a Jonah answer, and somehow it made Caleb's chest ache in the best way. "At the library." Jonah moved through the astronomy section like a seasoned navigator. He found the catalog, flipped through it on the floor, and eventually checked it out with his own card. He even smiled at the librarian, a woman who wore galaxy earrings and told him the next stargazing event would be held in 3 weeks. In the car, on the way home, Jonah was uncharacteristically chatty. "Do you think Zaria would like this catalog?" he asked. Caleb was surprised. "You want to send it to her?" "No, just maybe I could show her when we visit Seattle again." There it was. "Not if... when..." Caleb turned onto their street. Heart full. "I think she'd like that a lot." At home, while Jonah immersed himself in orbital models, Caleb finally returned a call he'd been putting off for 2 days. Dr. Lennox answered on the first ring. "How was the flight home?" she asked warmly. "Different," Caleb said. "In the best way." "Doctor..." Lennox waited, sensing more. He was steady, focused. He even defended his seat to a man complaining about his tapping, and he wants to come back. There was a pause. "Then I'm not surprised. Jonah knows where he feels safe." Caleb let the silence stretch. "I'm considering moving back," he said finally. "To Seattle. For good. Doctor, Lennox's voice stayed calm. That's a big decision, I know, but everything about this house, this job, this routine, it's still built around surviving Elena's loss, not building a life for Jonah. And for you, Caleb exhaled slowly. Maybe that too. They spoke for 20 minutes, discussing school options, housing near SNLC, even how Jonah could be eased into more social environments at his own pace. When they hung up, Caleb sat alone in his office, fingers steepled beneath his chin. He wasn't a man prone to impulsivity. He built aerospace software for a living. Everything he did was about reducing risk, planning for failure, preparing for wind shear and engine loss. But this wasn't a failure scenario. It was a launch window. 2 days later, he broke the news to Jonah. They were sitting on the back steps, watching the light fade behind their neighbor's maple tree. I'm thinking of selling the house, Caleb said. Jonah didn't look up. Because of Seattle. Yes. Jonah was quiet for a long time. Then would I have to go to regular school there? No. We'd keep working with Dr. Lennox and her team. You'd have input on all of it. Jonah's fingers curled around the hem of his hoodie. Would we see Amani again? Caleb smiled. I think that's very possible. Another long pause. I want to go, Jonah said finally. It's better there. It was the clearest yes Caleb had ever heard from his son. Over the next week, preparations began. Caleb informed his board of directors, arranged meetings with Seattle real estate agents. He called the SNLC team to schedule a transition plan. Through it all, Jonah helped drawing maps, setting timelines, organizing his books by state instead of genre. One evening, Caleb found a list on Jonah's desk titled, Things to Take to Seattle. At the top was a single name, Amani. Caleb stared at the list, heart caught between amusement and awe. He wondered what Jonah truly understood about connections, maybe more than most people ever would. That night, after Jonah had gone to bed, Caleb picked up the phone. He dialed the number he'd saved weeks ago and never used. Amani answered on the third ring. Mr. Monroe, she said, voice warm. You're calling late. Sorry, Caleb said, realizing the hour. We're moving to Seattle. A pause. Then that's wonderful. And Jonah? Well, he made a list. You're on it. Imani laughed softly. That's the highest honor I've ever received. Caleb's voice lowered. We'd love to see you again. Maybe have dinner sometime. As friends. Or whatever fits. Another pause. I'd like that, Imani said. The call ended, but something had opened. Not a door, a sky. And for the first time in years, Caleb wasn't afraid to step into it. The restaurant Caleb chose was quiet, tucked into a narrow side street in Capitol Hill with ivy climbing the brick walls and windows that framed the autumn dusk like paintings. He had called ahead, requesting a table in the corner, not too close to the kitchen, no candles, dim lighting. It wasn't about luxury, it was about comfort, about anticipating every detail that might ease Jonah's nerves before they had a chance to rise. Jonah arrived in his favorite navy blazer, the one Elena used to say made him look like a young professor. He carried a weathered leather-bound notebook and a pen with multiple ink cartridges, a gift from Zaria, sent in the mail last week, accompanied by a typed note that read simply, Write your skies. Caleb wore a jacket, but no tie. Amani arrived 5 minutes early. Her dress was simple, earth-toned, her hair pulled back into a low twist. She brought no makeup, no performance, only presence. When she saw Jonah standing just inside the entrance, she smiled, then crouched slightly to his level. You cut your hair, she said gently. noting the neat trim. Jonah blinked, then nodded. It was uneven in the back. Well, you look sharp. He stood a little straighter. They were seated in the corner booth Caleb had requested. Jonah took the far wall, where his back could rest against the corner and his eyes see the full room. Imani sat across from him. Caleb slid into the side seat, angled so he could see them both. A small bowl of bread arrived. Jonah didn't touch it. His fingers tapped the underside of the table in a slow, consistent rhythm. Imani leaned in slightly, not intrusively, just with curiosity. "Did you bring your notebook to show me something?" Jonah hesitated, then he pulled it out, flipping carefully to a bookmarked page. "I mapped the flight pattern we took from Boston," he said, "but I added what I think were your micro-adjustments during turbulence, based on the angle of descent." Imani blinked, then laughed softly. You noticed that Jonah nodded. The roll shift was small but precise. Caleb watched the exchange in quiet awe. Imani took the notebook, studying Jonah's notations as if it were a published paper. She pointed to one. "This one here." She said, "You marked a dip right after we passed Lake Michigan. That was me compensating for wind shear." Jonah looked up, something sparking behind his eyes. "You're the first person," he said slowly, "who's ever confirmed my flight pattern estimates." Imani smiled. "You're the first person who's ever noticed them." It wasn't loud, the moment. It didn't arrive with tears or declarations, but something opened between them. Recognition, not just of experience, but of precision, of care. They shared a language others missed entirely. The waiter approached, and Jonah visibly stiffened. Caleb glanced toward him, ready to intervene, but Imani spoke gently. "Would it be all right if I ordered for us, Jonah, or would you like to?" Jonah hesitated. "You can, but no mushrooms." "No mushrooms," she confirmed, smiling at the waiter. "One grilled chicken, plain, no sauce, no garnish, lemon water, and for the table, no aromatic spices." The waiter scribbled and left without fuss. Jonah stared at her. "You remembered?" "I listen," she said. Caleb sipped his water. "You always did." They talked through the meal. Nothing dramatic, just gentle sharing. Jonah asked Imani about her first flight. She told him about getting lost in Denver's Terminal B and calling Zaria in tears. Jonah offered a theory about how noise levels affect directional sense. Imani nodded thoughtfully. Caleb barely spoke, not because he wasn't part of it, but because watching his son actually engage, felt like watching the moon rise where there'd only ever been shadow. Toward the end of dinner, Jonah placed his fork down with precision and looked directly at Imani. "My mom used to say people leave shadows," he said, "not just footprints." Imani tilted her head. "What kind of shadows?" "The kind that stay when someone is gone. Even if you clean everything, her books still smell like vanilla. Her handwriting is in my science textbook. I don't remember her voice anymore, but her shadow is always in the kitchen." Caleb closed his eyes for a beat. Imani reached across the table, not to touch, just to be near. She left a beautiful shadow. She said, "And you're carrying it forward." Jonah nodded once. "I think she would have liked you." "She's the reason I was able to help you," Imani replied. "I was trained, but what I did came from something bigger, from watching Zaria, from knowing what it means to be overwhelmed in a world that rarely slows down. Your mother understood that." Jonah opened his notebook again. "Then, maybe you can help me figure something out." He turned the page. It was blank. "I want to write about the flight." he said, "but I don't know what to call it. It wasn't bad. It wasn't good either. It was confusing and loud, but it changed things." Imani looked at him carefully. Then she offered, "Maybe it was the beginning of something." Jonah tapped his pen. "Beginnings are hard to define." "They are." She agreed. "But you can always rename them later." Jonah nodded, then carefully wrote at the top of the page, "Flight 3876 Pattern Breaker." Caleb's heart clenched. After dessert, Jonah excused himself to the restroom. Caleb leaned forward, his voice low. "I wasn't sure about tonight, about how he'd handle it. And now he's rewriting it," Caleb said. "The memory, the meaning. You're helping him reframe everything." "I'm just here," Imani said softly. "You both are doing the real work." Caleb met her eyes. "I've been wondering if that night changed everything. I keep trying to trace the pattern." She smiled. "Maybe it didn't change things. Maybe it revealed what was already possible." Jonah returned then, hair damp from washing his hands twice. He looked between them and tilted his head slightly. "You're both quiet," he said. "Just full." Caleb answered, "In every sense." Jonah looked down at his notebook. "Me too." Outside, the air had grown cold. They walked to the car slowly, Imani's hand brushing Caleb's as they talked about constellations and flight paths. Before they said goodbye, Jonah turned to Imani. "Can we do this again?" With Zarya too, Imani's breath caught. "Yes," she said, "absolutely." And as they pulled away, Jonah leaned his head against the window, whispering to himself as he watched the stars emerge. Pattern Breaker. It wasn't just the title of his new entry. It was the beginning of everything that would come next. Zarya lived in a single-level craftsman home, nestled in a quiet corner of Beacon Hill. The porch was painted lavender. Wind chimes hung from the eaves, tinkling softly in the late morning breeze. It was a Sunday, just like any other on the street. Except for Jonah, everything about it felt calibrated differently. He adjusted his backpack straps twice before stepping onto the porch. Caleb stood beside him, hands in his jacket pockets. Imani had already gone inside, letting them approach at their own pace. Jonah paused at the threshold. "You okay?" Buddy Caleb asked. "Careful not to rush." Jonah tilted his head. "I am regulating." Caleb nodded. "Take your time." Jonah closed his eyes for a full 7 seconds. Then he opened the door and walked inside. The scent hit him first. Vanilla and cedarwood. Something about it reminded him faintly of Elena. It was not the same, but it was adjacent, like harmony beneath a melody. The walls were covered in framed sketches, some abstract, some detailed renderings of cities and stars. There were weighted blankets folded neatly on chairs, books arranged by size and color, and in the center of it all, Zarya. She sat on a low couch, her tablet resting on her lap, a stylus in her hand. Her hair was braided close to her scalp, long box braids that fell neatly behind her shoulders. She wore soft layers of cotton and fleece. Her shoes were off. When Jonah entered, she looked up. Her gaze was direct but calm, not invasive, not interrogating, just seeing. Imani crossed to Zarya and signed something quickly with her hands. Zarya responded with a nod, then turned her tablet to face Jonah. A line of typed words appeared in a clean sans serif font. "Hello, Jonah. I'm glad you are here. Would you like to sit in the circle chair? It spins." Jonah blinked. Then, to Caleb's quiet astonishment, he stepped forward and sat. The chair was soft, curved, and indeed it rotated smoothly. Jonah gave it one slow turn before planting his feet. Zaria typed again. I like your tapping rhythm. It reminds me of my train map from New York. Would you like to see it? Jonah's eyes widened. Yes, he said, his voice clear. Zaria opened a second app and displayed a color-coded subway diagram, each line labeled not only by destination, but by tonal vibration. She had translated the routes into musical scales. Jonah gasped. This is brilliant, he whispered. Caleb sat back, allowing the exchange to unfold. Imani joined him quietly in the kitchen, pouring tea for everyone, letting the moment breathe. Did you know she could do that? He asked. I did, Imani said, smiling. But I also knew Jonah would recognize it as something special. In the living room, Jonah had taken out his own notebook and was showing Zaria his chart of star visibility based on aircraft altitude and time zones. Zaria nodded, then typed a new line. You see patterns like me, but yours move with the sky. Mine stay with the rails. Jonah nodded slowly, but we both chart motion. Zaria smiled, then typed, Most people try to stop motion. They want stillness. But we hear it, see it. That is not a flaw. It is design. Jonah read that sentence 3 times. Then he stood, walked over to her, and held out his pen. This is the best pen I have, he said. Zaria took it reverently, then handed Jonah a small wire model of the Brooklyn Bridge she had crafted out of recycled copper. They didn't call it a trade, but it was. Caleb felt something in his chest tighten and release all at once. Lunch was quiet, comfort food, steamed rice, roasted vegetables, grilled fish with no seasoning beyond sea salt, no talking while chewing, no eye contact unless invited. Zaria typed occasional thoughts into her tablet, which Jonah read carefully. At one point, he asked her, Does noise ever make you feel like your skeleton is too loud? Zaria replied immediately. Yes, especially fluorescent lights. They hum like teeth grinding. Jonah exhaled like he had been holding that truth alone for too long. After lunch, they moved to the backyard, where Zaria had built a small sensory garden. Jonah knelt beside the patch of rosemary and lemon balm, letting the textures brush his palms. He didn't speak. Neither did Zaria, but she sat beside him. That was enough. Caleb watched from the porch steps, Imani beside him. He's never been this open, Caleb admitted, not even with his therapists. Because they were therapists, Imani said. Zaria's not trying to fix him. She's showing him what can be built. Caleb turned to her. Thank you for this, for letting him into her world. She was the one who said yes, Imani replied, and Jonah walked in on his own. They sat in comfortable silence until Jonah returned, notebook in hand. He looked at Imani and asked, May I read something to her? Of course, she said. Jonah turned to Zaria. This is about the flight. I didn't understand it then, but I'm starting to. He opened to the page he had titled Pattern Breaker. His voice was clear, if tentative. On Flight 2876, my body became uncontainable. My brain entered loop mode. I expected rejection, reprimand. But instead, someone gave me rhythm to follow. That's what Imani did. She gave me rhythm, like a conductor, like rails under a train. Zaria's fingers danced across her screen. That's poetry, and it's accurate. I'd like to hear more someday. Jonah looked to Caleb. Can we come back next weekend? Caleb smiled. If Zaria agrees, absolutely. Zaria's response was simple. Yes, I would like that. Later, as they prepared to leave. Jonah turned to Imani. Your family is safe, he said. Imani's throat tightened. You're part of it now, she said. Jonah nodded, then looked back at the lavender porch as if trying to memorize its place in his new constellation of safe spaces. In the car on the way home, Jonah was quiet, but not distant. He was cataloging, reordering, shifting memory into story. And in that quiet, Caleb felt a peace he hadn't known since before the world fell apart. They weren't just healing, they were building together. The announcement came just as they passed through TSA. Attention passengers on Flight 5123 to San Diego. Due to severe thunderstorms along the West Coast corridor, departure has been delayed by approximately 2 hours. Please check with your gate agents for updated information. Jonah stopped mid-step. Caleb felt his son's fingers tighten around his wrist. The pattern was familiar. Sudden change, loss of predictability, fracture in the expected sequence. He dropped into a crouch beside him. "Jonah," he said gently, "I know this is hard, but we're okay. We've got time." Jonah's breath caught in his throat. "What time will we land now? What gate? What happens if the delay becomes a cancellation?" Caleb glanced toward Imani, who had already stepped aside to open the gate app on her phone. She tapped the screen, then nodded at Caleb to give her a moment. "Worst case?" "We're delayed a few hours," Caleb said. "Best case? We get there just a little later than planned. Nothing we can't handle." Jonah pressed his palms together. "The sequence is broken." Caleb didn't correct him. Instead, he offered something true. "Yes," he said, "it is. But we can still make a new pattern." Imani returned, calm and precise. "Gate B12 has lounge seating and fewer overhead announcements," she said. "We can wait there." Jonah nodded slowly. "Quieter is better." The walk to Gate B12 was quiet. Jonah tracked every arrival-departure board with laser focus, repeating flight numbers under his breath. By the time they reached their seats, his breathing had returned to normal. Caleb handed him his tablet. Jonah settled into a window seat, plugging in headphones and running a simulation app on air traffic delay models. "Crisis contained," Caleb whispered. Imani smiled. "You know, when I was little, Zaria would scream during thunder. I mean blood-curdling, cover-your-ears kind of scream. And the moment it passed, she would hum. Same melody every time. Took me years to realize it was her nervous system resetting." Caleb turned toward her. "That's beautiful. And heartbreaking. Isn't everything that matters," Imani said, watching Jonah work quietly. "A little of both." They sat together in the lounge, side by side, but angled slightly toward each other, like open parentheses. "You always this good with crisis?" Caleb asked, meaning it both sincerely and curiously. Imani laughed lightly. "You mean with Jonah? Or with men who can't sit still during flight delays?" Caleb raised his hands in mock surrender. "Guilty as charged." She studied him for a moment. "I don't know if I'm good. I just understand the cadence of uncertainty. Grew up with it. You can't control how the world reacts to your sister melting down in the middle of a grocery store. But you can learn to anchor, to be the calm in her storm." Caleb nodded slowly. "And who anchored you?" It was the first time he'd asked her anything that personal. Imani hesitated. "Then no one, really. I just became my own gravity." They sat with that truth, the heaviness of it. "She's lucky to have you," Caleb said softly. "I mean that." Imani glanced at him, something tender in her eyes. "So is Jonah, and so are you. You just don't always know it." The overhead lights dimmed slightly as the afternoon sun dipped behind thick clouds outside. Jonah pulled his knees up to his chest in the window seat, completely absorbed in a complex coding puzzle on his screen. I didn't expect any of this, Caleb admitted. When we moved from Boston, I was just trying to escape the ache. I wasn't building a future. I was running from the past. Imani looked at him carefully, and now Caleb exhaled. Now I think I might be healing. Not fully, but something's different. I don't feel like I'm failing him every day. That's new. Imani reached into her bag and pulled out a small metal token. Zaria made this for you, she said, handing it to him. It was a compass, hand-cut and etched with the words "You are not lost," just rerouted. Caleb stared at it, then back at her. She told me after your last visit, Imani said, her voice soft. She said you don't need a therapist. You need permission. Permission to start again. He felt his throat tighten. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. Just carry it. Caleb closed his fingers around the compass. The cool metal seemed to warm in his palm. Jonah looked up at that moment. Is the delay still in effect? He asked. Yes, Caleb said, but we've got snacks, power outlets, and people who care about us in the same room. Jonah considered that. That's a reasonable compromise. He decided. An hour later, the rain began. Thick rivulets of water streaked the terminal windows, blurring the view of runways and taxiing aircraft. But inside Gate B12, time passed gently. Caleb and Imani played cards. Jonah built a model of the Boeing 787 out of virtual building blocks. Every so often, he would pause to describe his model to Imani, who listened with the patient attentiveness of someone who understood how much trust it took to share passion. When the boarding announcement finally came, there was no spike in Jonah's stress, only a nod, a closing of his tablet, a smooth rise from the seat. The earlier disruption had become simply part of the new plan. As they walked down the jet bridge, Caleb turned to Imani. Dinner after we'd land? She smiled. You cooking? I was thinking of ordering pizza and calling it rustic. I accept your offer. On board. The seats were arranged in a 2-2-2 configuration. Jonah took the window again. Caleb sat beside him, Imani across the aisle. As the engines began their warm-up sequence, Jonah leaned toward his father. Did you know lightning doesn't strike airplanes because of how they're grounded? I did, Caleb said. But I like hearing you explain it. Jonah nodded. It's not about the storm. It's about how you handle the current. Caleb smiled, eyes shining. Exactly. They took off into the storm. But inside the cabin, there was calm. Jonah read from a new book, Zaria's recommendation on neuroplasticity in young minds. Imani reviewed her crew schedule for next week. Caleb simply watched them both, the softest kind of awe washing over him. He thought about the compass in his pocket. He thought about the woman across the aisle. He thought about his son, calm mid-flight. He thought about Elena, and for the first time in years, the past no longer screamed. It whispered, and it gave way to possibility. The seatbelt light dimmed as the aircraft leveled off at cruising altitude. Outside, the sky had softened to a shade of bruised blue, the worst of the storm left behind them. Inside, the cabin lights adjusted to a low glow, mimicking sunset. The atmosphere felt hushed, calm. Caleb exhaled slowly, not realizing how tightly he had been holding his breath since takeoff. He looked at Jonah, who was seated beside him, absorbed in his annotated flight manual. Jonah's hands moved in rhythmic motion across the laminated pages, a soft flapping at the fingertips that Caleb now recognized not as distress, but as self-soothing, a kind of quiet celebration. Across the aisle, Imani leaned back slightly in her jump seat near the galley, a cup of tea cradled in her hands. She gave Caleb a gentle nod as their eyes met, an unspoken confirmation that everything was, for now, okay. The cabin was peaceful, but something about the pilot's voice earlier had stayed with Caleb. There had been a moment, just before takeoff, when the captain's calm announcement had faltered, if only for a breath. It wasn't something most passengers would notice, but Caleb had. The cadence had changed. The voice had paused, as if caught between scripts. Curiosity tugged at him. When the flight attendant on duty passed by to check meal preferences, Caleb asked quietly, "May I speak to the captain when it's convenient? Just a brief hello." The attendant blinked, then smiled. "He actually asked if you'd be willing to come up to the flight deck after meal service. Said he wanted to thank you personally." Me, Caleb asked. "Surprised?" The attendant nodded. "Captain Barron's recognized your name from the manifest." Caleb sat back, unsettled but intrigued. After the cabin settled with dinner trays and quiet conversations, the same flight attendant returned and led him forward. Jonah looked up from his seat but remained calm. Caleb gave him a reassuring nod. The cockpit door opened, revealing a familiar face older now, weathered and grayer, but unmistakable. "Alex Barron's," the pilot said, extending his hand. "You probably don't remember me." Caleb shook the offered hand slowly. "Actually, I do. You flew the last flight my wife was ever on. She wrote about you in her journal. Said you reminded her of her father." Alex smiled, eyes softening. She was extraordinary. She had this presence. We spoke before boarding. Something about her like she already knew too much of the world and loved it anyway. Caleb blinked, thrown by the detail. "You talked to her." "She noticed I was reading a book on flight psychology. We ended up discussing the role of fear and control in human response systems. She told me she was pregnant." Caleb felt a pressure in his chest. "With Jonah." Alex nodded slowly. "She said she hoped her child would inherit her curiosity, but not her anxiety." Caleb swallowed hard. "I don't know if she got her wish." "I think she did," Alex said. "You know, I've followed your work for years. Monroe Aerospace changed the way we think about flight safety systems. I read your paper on predictive turbulence modeling 6 times. I didn't realize it had made its way to pilots." Alex chuckled. "It did. You have no idea how many white-knuckle landings your algorithms have helped soften." There was a pause. The hum of the plane surrounded them like a cocoon. "Why did you want to speak with me?" Caleb asked. Alex looked at him for a long moment. "Because Amani Rhodes saved my daughter." The connection didn't land immediately. "Your daughter Caleb," repeated. Alex turned and pulled a photo from the small storage shelf behind him. It was a young woman, freckles, dark auburn curls, eyes that looked too old for their age. She was smiling, holding up a medal. "She's on the spectrum. We didn't know until middle school. By then, she'd been suspended 3 times for defiance. No one saw what was happening." He handed the photo to Caleb. "She met Amani on a flight from Atlanta when she was 13. It was her first time flying alone. She had a panic attack boarding. Amani sat with her for 2 hours after landing. Missed her next assignment. She's the one who told us your daughter isn't defiant. She's overwhelmed." Caleb stared at the image. "I never knew." "She wouldn't have wanted you to," Alex said. "But when I saw your name on the manifest, and I saw Jonah, your son, I just thought you should know who you're flying with." Caleb handed the photo back carefully. "She never said anything. She wouldn't. That's who she is." The 2 men stood in the narrow space behind the cockpit, quiet again. not as strangers now, but as fathers who had both witnessed how the right person at the right time can change the direction of a life. "Thank you for telling me," Caleb said. "Really?" As he walked back to his seat, the cabin lights now dimmed for rest, Caleb felt different, like another puzzle piece had clicked into place. Imani looked up as he returned. "Everything okay?" Caleb didn't sit right away. He leaned against the seat, one hand on her headrest. "You saved the daughter of our pilot," he said. "Years ago, you changed her life." Imani blinked, stunned. "I didn't even know he remembered." "He did," Caleb said, "and so will we." He took his seat next to Jonah, who glanced sideways at him. "Did you meet the pilot I did?" Caleb said. "He knew your mother. Spoke to her on her last flight." Jonah looked down at his tray. Quiet. Then he said, "Do you think she was afraid? No," Caleb said with certainty. "I think she was full of hope." Jonah nodded once. "Okay." They spent the rest of the flight in a pocket of soft silence, broken only by the sound of Jonah flipping pages in his book and the occasional rustle of movement from other passengers. When the aircraft began its descent into San Diego, Caleb reached over and took his son's hand. "We're going to be okay," he said. Jonah didn't answer in words, but he squeezed his father's hand. Sometimes that was enough, and as they descended through the clouds, Caleb realized something. Even in the air, even surrounded by turbulence and uncertainty, you could still find solid ground. If you had the right people with you, if you remembered who you were flying beside, and who you were flying for. The hotel lobby was quiet when they arrived. Polished marble floors reflected warm yellow lights from crystal chandeliers overhead. A tall ficus tree stood in the corner beside a worn leather couch. Jonah, suitcase in one hand, calculator in the other, stepped cautiously into the space like it was foreign ground. Caleb followed behind, observing the way his son's eyes flicked from the reception desk to the ceiling lights, then to the elevator bays in the back. He was calculating, assessing, adapting. Imani came in through the revolving doors a moment later, wind-blown and bright-eyed from the taxi ride she had taken separately. She was still in her uniform, bag slung across her shoulder. "I hope I'm not late." "You're right on time," Caleb said with a smile, then glanced toward the front desk. "I already checked us in. 2 adjoining rooms." He handed Imani a key card. Jonah looked at both of them and said, "Our rooms face north. Room 1214 and 1216. That means sunrise won't be visible from the windows." "Correct," Caleb replied, adjusting the strap on his laptop bag. Imani leaned toward Jonah slightly. "That also means you won't have direct glare on your screens in the morning. Less sensory interference." Jonah blinked, then nodded. Acceptable trade-off. They made their way to the elevator in silence, suitcases rolling behind them on the polished floor. When the doors opened, the interior was mirrored on 3 sides. Jonah hesitated before stepping in. "Too much reflection?" Imani asked gently. "I can manage," Jonah said. "I'll close my eyes until we reach the 12th floor." The elevator ride began. As the doors slid closed, the mirrored enclosure seemed to swallow them in a capsule of silence. Caleb pressed the button for their floor. The elevator hummed to life. At floor 5, the car stopped and another couple entered, murmuring about dinner reservations. Jonah turned slightly into the corner, withdrawing. Imani shifted her stance to stand slightly in front of him, subtly shielding him without making it obvious. Caleb noticed and felt a surge of gratitude. These small things she did without fanfare mattered more than anyone outside their circle could understand. At floor 9, the couple exited. and they were alone again. Jonah opened his eyes. "I prefer stairs." "I know," Caleb replied. But this once, the elevator felt easier. Jonah considered. "The staircase has more sound echo. You made the correct choice." Caleb smiled to himself. Every decision was a balance. But it was moments like this that reminded him Jonah noticed more than anyone gave him credit for. When they reached the 12th floor, the hallway was long and carpeted, quiet except for the occasional ding of another elevator further down the corridor. Jonah walked straight to room 1214 and inserted his card with practiced precision. It lit green. The door clicked open. "I'll unpack by category," Jonah announced, already rolling his suitcase inside. "Pajamas first, then chargers. We'll meet in 20 for dinner." Caleb called gently after him. "I'll set a timer," Jonah answered, voice fading behind the closing door. Caleb turned toward his own room but paused. Imani stood at her door across from his key card in hand. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded but didn't move to enter her room. "I've worked 100 flights," she said softly, "but something about today stuck to me differently. Jonah, you." Caleb leaned against the doorframe. "You've been incredible." She let out a short laugh. "I wasn't fishing, but thank you. I guess I just keep thinking about how I almost didn't speak up on the plane, how close I came to staying quiet. And if I had, everything would be different." Caleb's voice dropped to a hush. "You reached him, not just calmed him. Reached him. Do you know how rare that is?" Imani looked away briefly, then back. "You said earlier that Jonah didn't cry until I touched his shoulder, that it was like permission." "Yes," Caleb replied. "It was." They stood in the hallway, lights dimmed low for evening, the silence between them charged with unspoken things. "There's a part of me," Imani began, voice slower now, "that always wonders if I'll ever be more than someone who helps other people find their peace." Caleb tilted his head, surprised by the vulnerability. "Like," she continued, "I carry so many stories in my chest, so many faces I remember from flights and hospitals and quiet breakdowns, but no one carries mine, not in that way." He stepped closer, just a breath away. Maybe it's time someone did. For a moment, the air between them was heavy with possibility. Then a sound interrupted them. Jonah's door opened. "I finished unpacking early," Jonah said. Holding his tablet, I adjusted the schedule. Caleb straightened, clearing his throat. Imani offered a soft smile. "Ready for dinner?" she asked. "Yes," Jonah replied. "I would prefer window seating." "Then let's go," Caleb said, gesturing down the hallway. As they made their way to the elevator, Imani and Caleb walked side by side. Their fingers didn't touch, but they stayed close, their conversation suspended, but not forgotten. Dinner was quiet, slow, intentional. Jonah chose the seat by the window, positioning himself so he could watch the flow of headlights down below while eating grilled chicken and plain rice. Caleb and Imani talked in low tones, stopping often to include Jonah, who seemed more present than usual, even offering a few spontaneous comments about the flavor of the food and the layout of the restaurant. After dinner, back in the hallway of the 12th floor, Caleb hesitated again. "Would you join me for a cup of tea?" he asked Imani. "Just talk." Imani hesitated for only a second. "Yes." They stepped into his room. It was neat, but impersonal, like all hotel rooms. Caleb started the kettle and pulled 2 paper cups from the tray. "I'm still learning," he admitted, "how to do this. Do what Imani asked, perching on the edge of the small couch. Be a person again," he said. "Outside of fatherhood and corporate planning, outside of grief." Imani nodded. Same. The kettle clicked. Caleb poured the tea, handed her a cup. She held it between her palms, breathing in the steam. I saw Jonah tonight. You did, Caleb asked. She nodded. I saw him watching you when you didn't notice. The way he mirrors your posture. The way he listens to your silence. Caleb sat down across from her. It terrifies me sometimes. That he's learning who to be from someone who's still figuring himself out. Imani smiled softly. Maybe that's the best kind of model. Not someone perfect, just someone trying. The clock ticked gently on the wall. The room settled into quiet again. Then Caleb said something he hadn't planned to. I think I want to try. Try what Imani asked. Letting someone carry my story, too. Their eyes met. A slow, understanding nod from Imani followed. Then maybe we try together. That night, they each returned to their rooms with hearts a little fuller, uncertainty a little softer, and the invisible threads between them a little more real. The elevator ride down in the morning would be just another ride. But what had happened in that hallway, in that quiet room with tea and two worn-out people, was something else entirely. Something beginning, something worth holding on to. The lobby was already bustling by mid-morning. Guests checked out with tired expressions and overstuffed suitcases. A concierge handed out city maps. Elevator dings echoed down the corridor, and the scent of fresh pastries drifted from the breakfast buffet near the glass-walled dining room. Caleb and Jonah sat at a corner table with plates of food between them, scrambled eggs, toast, a few blueberries Jonah had arranged in a perfect grid. Caleb sipped his coffee, eyes on his son, who was carefully buttering the exact edges of a toast slice. Every motion was precise, controlled, predictable. It used to break Caleb's heart. Now, he found comfort in it. Jonah was creating order in a world that rarely offered any. Dad, Jonah said, still focused on his plate. You're not eating? Caleb blinked. You're right. He picked up his fork, took a bite of the eggs, swallowed slowly. I was thinking. Jonah didn't look up. About turbulence again, Caleb chuckled. Yes, always a little. You can't prevent it, Jonah said. You can only prepare for it. A pause. Then Caleb whispered, Who taught you that you did? Jonah replied, Last year, before Boston. Caleb felt his chest tighten. It was one of the last calm nights before everything changed. He had forgotten saying it. Jonah had not. Before he could respond, movement near the hotel's glass doors caught his eye. A woman entered, tall, striking, purposeful in her stride. She wore a navy blue coat and carried a slim black folder under one arm. Her hair was tied back in a long braid that swung as she walked, and her expression was one of calm determination. Caleb didn't recognize her at first, but Jonah did. He stiffened. His toast hand froze mid-air. Caleb followed his gaze. The woman spotted them and immediately made her way over. Mr. Monroe, she asked, stopping at their table. Caleb stood slowly. Yes, she extended a hand. Dr. Sadie Lennox. I'm Imani's sister. Caleb's brow furrowed. I thought Zaria was Imani's sister. She is, Sadie replied. I'm her cousin. First cousin, technically, but she calls me sister. Always has. Jonah looked up. You're a doctor. Yes, Sadie answered. Clinical psychologist. I work with trauma and family systems. Imani thought I might reach out, but I preferred to wait until I could meet you face to face. Caleb gestured to the chair. Please, would you like to sit? Just for a moment, Sadie said, settling beside them. I know this is unexpected. I also know what you're carrying is heavier than it looks. Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly. What do you mean, I mean? She said gently. You're grieving a version of fatherhood you never got to live. You're managing a company, a child, and your own quiet unraveling. Jonah tilted his head. That's a strong assumption. Sadie smiled warmly at him. It is, but I've read Imani's reports. The in-flight incident, her debriefing. I've seen enough families to recognize when one is trying its absolute best not to break under the weight of love. Caleb's hands rested still on the table. Why now? Because Imani told me about last night. About your tea conversation. About the part of you that's tired of being the only safe place in the room. I thought maybe you deserved someone who could hold your story, without needing you to earn that right first. Jonah stood up. I need air. Caleb rose immediately. Jonah? I'll just be outside the doors, Jonah said with effort. Where the bike rack is. I can hear you from there. Caleb hesitated, then nodded. Jonah walked off, a little too quickly, his retreat full of managed panic. Sadie watched with a practiced eye. He's perceptive, she said, sharp and very loyal to you. Caleb sat down again. He's everything to me. I know, Sadie replied. But can I ask you something harder? He nodded. What happens when everything you are to him leaves no space for who you are to yourself? Caleb looked away. That's not the question I expected this morning. Most of the real ones aren't, Sadie said softly. Do you love Imani? The question sliced through the space between them. Caleb paused. We're still figuring that out. Not what I asked. He swallowed. Yes, I do. Then give her what she's never had, Sadie said. Stability. Real presence. Someone who doesn't run when the story gets messy. Caleb ran a hand through his hair. We've only just begun, which is the best time to choose the kind of beginning you want. Sadie replied. Outside the glass wall, Jonah was pacing now, counting his steps. Caleb watched his son's form through the reflection of the chandelier. I've made so many mistakes, he said aloud. So has everyone worth knowing, Sadie replied. But not everyone is brave enough to try again. She stood, smoothing her coat. Here's my card. I don't take clients related to my family, but I can connect you to the right people. For you, for Jonah. She placed it on the table. And Caleb. He looked up. You're not failing. You're just still becoming. She walked away, disappearing into the lobby crowd as quickly as she had come. Caleb picked up the card, studied it, then folded it carefully into his pocket. Outside, Jonah was waiting. As Caleb exited through the doors, his son turned. Who is she? Jonah asked. Someone who sees clearly, Caleb replied. Jonah nodded. Do we trust her? I think so, Caleb said. But we trust each other more. They walked side by side down the sidewalk, not speaking for a while. Finally, Jonah asked, What's next? Next, Caleb replied. We make choices that don't feel safe, but might be good. I'll need notice, Jonah said. You'll get it, Caleb promised. Back in the hotel, Imani was packing. Her shift began in a few hours. She paused when she saw the note Caleb had left by the bedside table. Let's talk before you leave. Jonah's schedule allows a 20-minute window. It made her smile. Outside, father and son were heading toward the park across from the hotel. A brief break before flights and meetings and all the things that pressed down again. But for this moment, they had air, movement, space, and the slow, brave building of something real. The sunlight filtering through the hotel window had a quiet softness, the kind that made everything feel momentarily slower, like time had agreed to take a breath. Imani stood at the far side of the room, her hand resting lightly on her rolling suitcase. She wasn't moving. Not really. Just hovering, like a plane caught in a holding pattern. Caleb watched her from the couch. He'd set aside his laptop, his phone face down on the coffee table. Jonah had gone to the hotel's business center for exactly 23 minutes to print out his new schedule for the week. The room, for once, was just theirs. "You're quiet," Caleb said gently. "I'm thinking," Imani replied. "About," she exhaled, turning to face him fully. "About whether we're walking into something real or holding on to something convenient. Comfortable." Caleb didn't speak right away. His eyes flicked to the window, where planes in the distance cut across the sky like silver thoughts against blue. "Can I ask something unfair?" he finally said. Imani raised an eyebrow. "Sure. Do you feel like I'm a project that caught her off guard?" "What?" "Sometimes I wonder," Caleb said softly, "if I've become this intersection of everything you care about: neurodiversity, social equity, compassion. You step into people's chaos and stabilize it. That's what you did for Jonah. For me. But is that love? Or is that just purpose?" Imani's expression softened. "That's not unfair. That's real." She moved across the room and sat down beside him. "You're not a project, Caleb. Neither is Jonah. But yes, part of what draws me to you is that you live inside the questions I care about most. Then what makes this different?" Imani tilted her head. "Because I don't want to fix you. I want to stay. That's a different muscle." Caleb leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Jonah's been stable, more than stable, since that flight, since you. Not just me," she corrected. "You moved states, changed your entire life to prioritize his. That's not a small thing. Caleb, most fathers wouldn't." He gave a half smile. "He's not most sons." "I know," she said quietly. There was a long pause. "You've been dancing around a decision," she said. "What is it?" Caleb sighed. "It's the board. They want me in New York. Full time." Imani stiffened slightly. "I've been managing remotely," he continued. "But the new contracts are high profile. Investors want leadership present. They offered to relocate Jonah and me, private support staff, school consultants. It's generous. And you haven't told Jonah." Caleb shook his head. "Not yet." Imani's voice was measured. "Because you know how he'll respond." "I don't want to undo what we've built here," he admitted. "He has friends. He has rhythm. For the first time in years, he doesn't wake up afraid of his own world." "And you," she asked. "I'm afraid of wrecking him," Caleb confessed. "But I also miss building things. I miss the adrenaline of it." Imani was silent for a moment. Then, "Have you considered letting Jonah be part of the decision? I don't want to put that pressure on him." "It wouldn't be pressure if you frame it right," she said. "It would be respect." He looked at her. Really looked. "You think he's ready, I think," she replied. "That he already knows something's changing, and that he'd rather be invited in than protected out." The room was still again. "Talk to him tonight," she said, "before he finds out from someone else." A soft knock interrupted them. Jonah stood at the door, holding his freshly printed schedule and a small brown bag of granola he'd picked up from the lobby. "Can we go to the Science Museum?" he asked. "They're featuring the Mars rover replica, and it's on my list." "Sure," Caleb said automatically. Imani Jonah asked, glancing between them. "Are you coming too?" She smiled. "If you'd like me to. Yes, he replied simply. "You ask good questions when the tour guides get lazy." That earned a laugh. The tension in the room thinned. Later that evening, after the museum and an early dinner at Jonah's favorite taco truck, they returned to the hotel. Jonah retreated to his corner with a new book and noise-canceling headphones. Content. Caleb glanced at the window. Darkness had fallen. City lights blinked like tiny decisions being made. "Jonah," he said softly. His son looked up. "I need to ask you something important." Jonah set the book aside. Slowly removing his headphones, "I've been offered a return to full-time work," Caleb began. "In New York. It would mean moving, starting over again, but with more resources, more structure, for both of us." Jonah's brows furrowed. "We just started over." "I know," Caleb said. "That's why I'm asking, because I want your thoughts." Jonah was quiet for a long moment. "Do I have to decide now?" "No," Caleb replied. "But soon." Jonah picked at the edge of his sweater. "Would Amani come with us?" Caleb hesitated. "We haven't talked about that yet." Jonah nodded, his mind already whirring. "Can I make a pros and cons list?" "Yes," Caleb said. "That would help me too." Jonah stood, walking toward the window. "Do I have a voice?" Caleb joined him. "You always do." Jonah looked out at the stars. "Then I'll use it when I'm ready." And just like that, the decision loop wasn't Caleb's alone anymore. That night, as Jonah slept and the city dimmed around them, Caleb stood on the balcony. Imani joined him a moment later, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. He didn't panic. She said, "No," Caleb replied. He processed. On his terms. Imani leaned into his shoulder. "You gave him that?" "He's giving it back," Caleb murmured, "in ways I never imagined. From inside." Jonah stirred but did not wake. His book had fallen open beside him, a small post-it stuck to the page with careful handwriting. "Reminder I can change without breaking." Outside, the stars kept their silent rhythm, as if nodding in agreement. Tomorrow, the decision would begin to unfold, but tonight was still theirs. The lobby of Ryvern Capital's headquarters gleamed with a kind of over-polished glass and engineered calm that made Caleb's palms sweat. It was a kind of sterile ambition he remembered well, a place where every plant was artificial and every smile carefully timed. He hadn't worn a suit in over a year, but today it hung on him like armor. The tie felt foreign, like a thread pulling him back into a version of himself he wasn't sure he wanted to resurrect. They led him to the 49th floor, a corner conference room, floor-to-ceiling windows framing a dizzying view of Midtown Manhattan, the skyline he had once ruled, the skyline that had once ruled him. Sitting across the table was Marissa Chen, the board's newest powerhouse, finance sharp, PR sharper. She smiled in that way publicists do, polished, not quite warm. "Caleb," she said, standing to shake his hand. "It's good to see you in person." Finally, he nodded, measured, likewise. The room smelled faintly of eucalyptus and power. Marissa gestured for him to sit. Before the others joined, "I wanted to ask you something. Off the record." He tilted his head slightly. "Go on." She leaned forward, folding her hands. "Why now?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked out at the city, watching the movement below. "I needed time," he said finally. "My son went through something traumatic, and I did too, though I didn't recognize it until much later." She nodded as if that answer fit her spreadsheet of expectations. "Fair," she said. "You're still a legend here. You know, people talk about the Monroe algorithm like it's mythology." Caleb smiled faintly. Mythology tends to forget the nights spent debugging in a windowless server closet. Marissa chuckled, but her tone shifted as she tapped her pen once against her notepad. The board is concerned, she said, that your focus might still be elsewhere. My focus is clearer than it's ever been, he said. And what is that focus? Exactly, she asked, eyes narrowing slightly. Caleb leaned back. Impact, not just growth, not just burn rates and IPO windows. I want to build something that respects its people as much as its shareholders. Marissa studied him. You've changed. Grief does that. Fatherhood does that. Watching your child struggle in a world that doesn't understand him changes everything. Before she could respond, the rest of the board filtered in. Suits and cufflinks, laptops and talking points. The air turned colder, more corporate. Introductions were made, formalities exchanged. Then came the slide decks. Caleb sat through them. Quarterly projections, market penetrations, scalable solutions. It was all familiar, a language he had once spoken fluently. But he found his attention drifting to the notebook in his jacket pocket, where Jonah's hand-drawn weekly schedule lived. To the email Imani had sent that morning, a photograph of Jonah at the planetarium, standing beside a replica of the Mars rover with a grin that split his face in half. To the ache in his chest that came not from nostalgia, but from clarity. Caleb, one of the partners asked, if you were to return as CTO, what would be your first strategic move? He didn't answer right away. Then he said, simply, I'd rebuild the onboarding process. There was a pause. Confused looks. The onboarding process, someone echoed. That's HR's domain. Caleb nodded. Exactly. And that's the problem. You're hemorrhaging young talent. Neurodivergent coders. Developers who think in patterns instead of pitch decks. They don't last because this place isn't built for them. One of the partners frowned. Are you suggesting we redesign the company around? Special accommodations, I'm suggesting, Caleb said evenly. That inclusion isn't a feature. It's a foundation. You want innovation. Stop filtering out every mind that doesn't think like yours. The room was quiet, tense. Marissa cleared her throat. Caleb, you know we support diversity. Diversity is a photo op, he said quietly. Inclusion is policy. A beat passed. Then another. You asked me what my focus is, Caleb continued. It's building a company where my son could one day intern and not have to mask who he is. Somebody shifted uncomfortably. That's a nice sentiment. One of the senior partners offered. But this is a high-stakes environment. Not everyone can handle the pressure. Caleb stood. I appreciate your time, he said. Truly. But I think we're building different things. And with that, he walked out. He didn't take the elevator down right away. Instead, he went up. To the rooftop terrace he used to escape to when everything below felt too loud. The wind up there was cold and clean. He dialed Imani. You done already? She asked, surprised. I was done before I walked in, he admitted. I just didn't know it yet. She was silent for a moment. Then, how do you feel, Free? He said, and a little terrified. That's usually a good sign, she said gently. He smiled. Is Jonah back from the museum? He just walked in. She replied, He's making tea. Can you tell him I'll be home by dinner? Of course, she said. We'll wait for you. That night, as he walked into their apartment, Jonah was at the kitchen table with a spreadsheet of pros and cons he'd color-coded himself. Hi, Dad, he said without looking up. I added 3 new reasons to stay. Want to hear them? Caleb dropped his bag and sat beside him. Yes, I really do. Jonah read them aloud, one by one. Number 1, I can see stars here without light pollution. Number 2, Imani makes better pancakes than the chef at the corporate hotel. Number 3, I don't lose myself here. Caleb blinked back tears. Those are good reasons, he said. The best ones, actually. Jonah looked up. Did they offer you the job they did? Caleb said. Jonah studied him. Are we staying? Caleb nodded. We're staying. Jonah exhaled slowly, then nodded once. Good. I already unpacked the suitcases. Caleb laughed. Then he reached over and ruffled his son's hair. They had chosen together, and the world, for once, felt perfectly aligned. The telescope sat patiently on the balcony, its lens angled upward like a silent question aimed at the night. Jonah had spent most of the afternoon fine-tuning its calibration. He had written down the planetary alignment schedule in his notebook, double-checked the weather app twice an hour, and even prepared his snacks ahead of time. Observation night was serious business. Inside, Caleb sat at the kitchen island, watching his son through the sliding glass door. Jonah moved with a calm, focused energy, adjusting dials, peering into the eyepiece, scribbling notes. He had found his rhythm again, the same rhythm that had been stripped from him during the flight 3 months ago. Caleb sipped his tea, the taste sharp and grounding. Imani was humming softly as she dried dishes beside him. There was an ease in her movements now, like her presence had seeped into every corner of their home. She wasn't just visiting anymore. She belonged. Jonah came in from the balcony, a small flashlight clipped to his hoodie. It's time, he said, his tone a mixture of reverence and urgency. Jupiter's at peak visibility. Caleb smiled. Let's go then. They stepped out into the night air. Jonah handed Caleb a pair of observation goggles he had modified to reduce blue light and sharpen contrast. Imani followed, wrapping a light shawl around her shoulders, her eyes lifting to the stars as if they too had been waiting for her. The telescope captured Jupiter in all its brilliance. Jonah adjusted the focus and stepped back. Your turn, he said to Caleb. Caleb leaned in and was stunned. The planet hovered with impossible clarity, its bands swirling with energy, its 4 largest moons aligned like pearls on an invisible string. She's beautiful, Caleb murmured. Jupiter is genderless, Jonah corrected gently, though not unkindly. Right, Caleb said with a quiet laugh. They're beautiful. Jonah nodded. It helps to use precise language. Space deserves that. Imani chuckled, standing between them. Everything deserves precise language, especially the things we love. They took turns with the telescope, each one quietly marveling at the universe. After a while, Jonah returned to his notebook, sketching orbits, labeling coordinates, writing down what he called probable trajectories. I want to track a moon through a full cycle, he said, not looking up, not Earth's moon, one of Jupiter's. That might take weeks. Caleb said. I know, Jonah replied, but it's worth it. Something about the certainty in his voice struck Caleb. There was no hesitation, no apology for the depth of his interest. Jonah had reclaimed his voice, his joy. He was becoming himself again. Back inside. Imani pulled out a folded piece of paper from her purse. I need your opinion, she said to Caleb, handing it to him. It was a flyer. Simple design. Clean typography. At the top, it read Voices Unmasked, an evening of neurodiverse storytelling. You're speaking, he asked. She nodded. Zaria organized it. I wasn't going to do it at first, but Imani hesitated. You reminded me that honesty matters more than polish. He looked at her, his expression soft. "You'll be incredible." Jonah peeked over Caleb's shoulder. "Can I come?" Imani's eyes widened slightly. "You want to?" Jonah nodded. "I want to hear the stories, especially Zarya's, and yours." Imani reached out slowly, brushing a piece of lint from Jonah's sleeve. "Of course you can. That means a lot to me." Later that night, after Jonah had gone to bed, Caleb and Imani sat on the couch, the telescope still pointed skyward outside. "There's something else," Imani said. Caleb turned to her, eyebrows raised. "I've been offered a position," she said, "with a new initiative. Flight training for neurodiverse young adults. It's a mentorship program, started by a retired pilot in San Diego." "That sounds amazing," Caleb said. "Are you thinking of taking it?" "I am," she said slowly. "But it would mean a more structured schedule. I'd be gone during the day most weeks. Home evenings and weekends." Caleb considered this. "Jonah would miss you. So would I. But I think he'd also be proud of you." Imani smiled. "You think so, I know so," he said. "You're helping others navigate the skies the way you helped him. That's legacy work." She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "You always know how to say things that matter." Outside, the stars wheeled slowly across the sky, unbothered by deadlines or decisions. The next evening, they attended the storytelling event. The space was intimate, softly lit, with beanbags and string lights instead of chairs and fluorescents. Jonah brought his notebook, which he kept on his lap like armor. Zarya spoke first. Her story was about being told she was broken, only to discover later that her brain was simply wired for a different kind of brilliance. She spoke of rage and reclamation, of wearing noise-canceling headphones in boardrooms and refusing to apologize for stim movements during job interviews. When Imani took the stage, Jonah straightened in his seat. She told the story of Flight 3281, of a boy who could not be calmed by logic or authority, but who responded to presence, to calm. She didn't say Jonah's name, but everyone knew. She talked about how that moment made her realize the systems we build airlines, schools, hospitals are often designed to manage, not understand. And that understanding requires a radical act listening. When she finished, the room was silent for a heartbeat, then erupted in applause. Jonah leaned over to Caleb. "That was the right kind of loud," he whispered. Afterward, people came up to them, wanting to talk. Jonah surprised everyone by answering questions, not just with accuracy, but with nuance. Caleb stood back and watched. Not the boy who had once curled into himself on a plane seat, hands over his ears, the world too much, but a boy becoming a young man, curious and grounded, still different, but no longer invisible. They drove home in silence, the good kind, the kind filled with the residue of shared meaning. That night, Jonah knocked on Caleb's door. "Can I show you something?" Caleb nodded and followed him into his room. Jonah pulled a folded sheet of graph paper from his desk drawer. "I've been mapping our story," he said, "like a star chart. This is where it began." He pointed to a mark labeled F3281. "And this," he continued, "is tonight, a constellation of connection, of change." Caleb studied the diagram, moved beyond words. He put a hand on Jonah's shoulder. "You charted all of this. I wanted to make sure we didn't forget," Jonah said. "Because stories are like stars. Some are still shining, even after they've gone dark." Caleb's eyes blurred. He pulled his son into a hug. "No," he said, "we won't forget. Ever. Outside." The telescope waited. The sky above vast and unknowable, yet mapped now in new ways, not by instruments or satellites, but by hearts that had learned how to see. The Ryvern Aviation boardroom was sleek and sterile, all chrome and glass and hushed tones. Caleb sat at one end of the table, Jonah beside him, wearing his noise-reducing headphones and sketching orbital trajectories on a pad of paper. His legs swung slightly beneath his chair, rhythmic and grounded. Imani sat across from them, her face calm, but her fingers fidgeted just under the table where no one else could see. At the head of the table sat Marissa Chen, Chief Operating Officer, and one of the few people in the room who knew exactly why they were there. Around them were legal counsel, 2 board members from Ryvern, and Dr. Avery Lennox, who had insisted on attending in support. "Thank you all for being here," Marissa began. "This isn't a disciplinary meeting, nor is it a standard review. It is, instead, an opportunity for growth, for course correction." Caleb exhaled quietly. He had insisted that any confrontation be framed constructively, not as retribution for what had happened on Flight 3281, but as a turning point. The incident, long buried under PR statements and polite apologies, was resurfacing. Jonah's story had gained traction after the storytelling event. A clip of Imani's speech had gone viral, viewed over 3 million times. Public response was overwhelmingly supportive, but it had also forced Ryvern's hand. Policies needed revision, training programs needed transformation, and Caleb had come prepared. He slid a folder across the table to Marissa. Inside, "You'll find a new policy proposal," he said, "created with input from neurodiverse advocacy groups, education professionals, and travelers with first-hand experience. It outlines a framework for inclusive service training, a multi-tiered response protocol, and most importantly, a shift in how your staff defines disruption." There was a beat of silence before one of the board members, a silver-haired man named Gregory Lowell, leaned forward. "With respect, Mr. Monroe, what makes you the person to present this?" Caleb met his gaze evenly. "I am not an expert in neurodiversity, but I am the father of a boy who nearly suffocated under the weight of your silence. And I am also the majority shareholder of this company, due to recent acquisitions through my firm." Gregory stiffened. Marissa, however, simply opened the folder. "Thank you," she said. Jonah spoke next, his voice clear despite the headphones. "You don't need to make it perfect. Just make it safe." Every head turned to him. It was the first time many of them had heard Jonah speak in a corporate setting. He looked up from his sketch pad. "Safe doesn't mean quiet or still. It means being allowed to exist." Imani's eyes shimmered. Caleb swallowed the tightness in his throat. It was one thing to advocate for your child. It was another to watch him speak for himself. "Dr." Lennox followed. "The framework proposed here is not just ethical, it's scalable. And if implemented, it would make Ryvern a leader in accessible travel. Will it cost us?" someone asked. "Only if you define cost in dollars alone," Lennox replied. "What you'll gain is trust, loyalty, a future." After the meeting, the board agreed to pilot the new framework on all domestic flights within 6 months. Full implementation would take a year, but the first changes would be immediate. As they left the building, Jonah turned to Caleb. "Can we fly again soon?" he asked. Caleb blinked. "You want to?" "I want to try," Jonah said, "but this time with a plan." That night, the 3 of them sat around the kitchen table, planning their next flight together. It would be a short one. San Francisco to Seattle. Round trip. Booked on a Ryvern flight piloted by Captain Alex Behrens, The same man who had quietly intervened during Jonah's initial meltdown months ago. Imani mapped out the timeline. Jonah made a checklist. Caleb downloaded an app that tracked every plane in real time, letting Jonah follow their path in the sky. They called it the Reclaim Flight. It was more than a trip. It was a ritual, a return to the site of trauma, not to relive it, but to rewrite it. The morning of the flight. Jonah woke before dawn, already dressed, bag packed. He had written a script for himself, rehearsed questions for the crew, and laminated a card that explained his sensory needs and stimming behaviors. It was clipped to his hoodie with pride. At the airport, they moved with precision. Jonah kept his headphones on through security. Caleb handled the documents, and Imani provided a steady narrative of what was coming next. When they boarded, a flight attendant greeted them warmly. "Welcome aboard," she said to Jonah, crouching slightly so she was at eye level. "We're honored to have you today." Jonah handed her the laminated card. She read it without flinching, then nodded. "Thanks for letting me know. If you need a quiet space or a break, press the call button and we'll find a solution together." "Okay," Jonah nodded. "Okay." They settled into their seats. Jonah by the window, Caleb beside him, Imani across the aisle. As the plane taxied, Jonah began to flap his hands lightly, his eyes scanning the horizon. Caleb leaned over, nervous. "Not exactly," Jonah said. "It's just a lot of data. Once in the air." The clouds parted. Jonah lifted his sketch pad, tracing the curve of the earth he could now see from his window. He turned to his father. "It looks different from up here." "What does?" Caleb asked. "Everything." Imani reached across the aisle, brushing her fingers gently against Jonah's hand. "Maybe because you're different now, too," she said. The flight was uneventful. No disruptions, no judgment, just air, motion, and quiet joy. When they landed, the cabin filled with the usual flurry of activity. Jonah stayed seated until the aisle was clear. As they exited, the pilot stood at the door. "Good flight?" he asked. Jonah nodded. It was optimal. Caleb laughed. "High praise." Imani smiled. "Thank you. Captain?" "My pleasure," Alex said. "You all did the hard part. We just flew the plane." Back home that night, Jonah pinned a new map to his wall. He placed a sticker on San Francisco and another on Seattle, connecting them with a thread. "First completed loop," he said. Caleb wrapped an arm around him. "More to come." "Definitely," Jonah replied. They stood together, looking at the thread, not just as a line between cities, but as a symbol of what they had navigated together and what they had yet to explore. The day of the keynote arrived with a quiet sense of inevitability. It had been 9 months since Jonah's meltdown mid-flight, 9 months since Imani took his hand, since turbulence became testimony, since Caleb learned to stop managing his son and start listening. 9 months of transformation, of learning how to live not in spite of differences, but in harmony with them. Now they stood together backstage at the International Conference on Inclusive Aviation, held in a glass-paneled auditorium overlooking the Pacific. The air smelled faintly of salt and ambition. Inside, hundreds of attendees filled the seats: flight crews, airline executives, disability advocates, engineers, and parents. Caleb had been invited to deliver the closing address, not as a billionaire, not as a CEO, but as a father. But it wasn't just his voice that would carry across the room. It was Jonah's story, and this time, Jonah wanted to tell part of it himself. Caleb straightened his tie in the mirror, catching Jonah's reflection beside him. "You sure about this?" he asked gently. Jonah nodded. "I've done simulations." Caleb smiled. "It's not the same as standing in front of that many people." No, Jonah replied, but it's the same as telling the truth. That part doesn't change. Imani adjusted Jonah's blazer and kissed the top of his head. I'm proud of you, no matter what happens out there. I know, Jonah said simply. They walked to the stage entrance as the announcer read Caleb's name. He stepped up to the podium, adjusted the mic, and let the silence settle. Behind him, the large screen projected a photo of Jonah standing on the tarmac next to Captain Barron's, both of them smiling. Caleb began. Good morning. My name is Caleb Monroe. You probably know me from Ryvern Aviation or Quantum Corps, but today I stand here in a very different role. I'm not here as an executive or an innovator. I'm here as a father. He paused. Let that sink in. My son Jonah is autistic, and he is brilliant, but brilliance doesn't always translate to acceptance, especially at 35,000 feet. Caleb told the story, not with theatrics, but with measured honesty. The terminal tension, the meltdown, the silence from the crew, and the flight attendant who didn't look away. Imani Rhodes didn't see a disruption. She saw a human being in distress, and that changed everything. He spoke of the aftermath, the media frenzy, the personal reckoning, the slow rebuilding of trust and routine, of how Jonah had returned to the skies, how Ryvern had revised its policies, how one painful moment had become the seed for industry-wide change. None of this was easy, Caleb said, but progress never is, especially when it requires unlearning the systems we thought were working. He looked to the side of the stage, but rather than me telling you about my son, I'd like you to hear from him. The audience shifted, whispered, then stilled. Jonah walked out, steady, composed, his laminated support card still clipped to his lapel, though he no longer needed it. His hands moved rhythmically as he approached the second microphone. No one stopped him. No one stared. He began, voice soft but firm. My name is Jonah Monroe. I'm 16. I like physics, flight paths, and pasta with nothing on it. I also have autism. But that's just one thing about me. He took a breath. When I had a meltdown on a plane, people looked at me like I was dangerous, like I shouldn't be there, like I was a problem to be fixed or removed. There was no anger in his voice, just precision. But I'm not a problem. I'm a person. And I was scared. My brain was processing too much. The lights, the noise, the pressure. I couldn't make it stop. But then someone took my hand and said, "You're safe." And I believed her. That's why I'm here. He pointed to a slide now showing a diagram of flight crew response protocols, old versus new. This is the new policy Ryvern uses now. I helped design part of it. Murmurs of recognition rippled through the crowd. It's not perfect, but it means people like me don't have to hide or be punished for reacting to a world that was never built for us in the first place. He closed his notebook. Thanks for listening. That's all. Applause erupted, long and rising. Not polite, but powerful. When Jonah returned to his seat beside Caleb and Imani, he didn't smile, but his fingers tapped out a code of satisfaction only they understood. Afterward, a steady stream of people came to thank them. A pilot from Atlanta whose son had just been diagnosed. A flight attendant who had hidden her own neurodivergence for years. An airport designer inspired to reimagine sensory-friendly terminals. Back at their hotel that evening, the family sat on the balcony, wrapped in warmth and silence. Below them, the ocean whispered its approval. That was brave, Caleb said, looking at Jonah. It was necessary, Jonah replied. Imani leaned against Caleb's shoulder. You were both extraordinary. Jonah sipped his water. I was just accurate. They laughed. And for a while, that was enough. Later, as Jonah slept inside, Caleb and Imani stood under the stars, mirroring the moment from the early days when everything still felt fragile. "It's funny," Caleb said. "I used to believe I had to protect him from the world." "You still do," Imani replied. "But now you do it by letting him be seen." Caleb reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Imani froze, breath hitching, eyes wide. He opened it slowly. Inside was a simple ring, elegant and unadorned. "Imani Rhodes," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "You saved my son's life, and you rebuilt mine. Not because of what you did that day, but because of everything you've done since. I want to build a future with you, not out of gratitude, out of love." She didn't speak, just nodded, tears streaming silently. "Yes," she whispered, "yes." They kissed under the night sky, a promise exchanged with the stars above as witnesses. No turbulence, just lift. The next morning, Caleb found Jonah at the window, watching a plane ascend into the dawn. "Where to next?" Caleb asked. Jonah turned, thoughtful. "I don't know, but I think we're cleared for takeoff." And with that, the sky opened wide. The plane landed, but the journey was just beginning. Jonah Monroe, once misunderstood and mislabeled, now helps shape airline policies for neurodivergent passengers around the world. Imani Rhodes, the woman who extended her hand in a moment of chaos, became the bridge between silence and safety, between trauma and trust. And Caleb Monroe, a father once obsessed with control, learned that true strength doesn't come from power, but from presence. This was never just about one boy. It was about how society defines value, about how we treat those who process the world differently, about how deeply rooted prejudice, even in the air, can be dismantled not with force, but with listening. So ask yourself, what if we judged less and understood more? What if inclusion wasn't a policy, but a promise? This story reminds us that every meltdown has a message, and every person, regardless of how they communicate, is worthy of dignity, space, and love. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it end here. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more true stories that challenge prejudice and celebrate humanity. We'll see you in the next one. Until then, listen deeper, love louder.